5 true crime cases, no household names, no Netflix documentaries, and somehow every single case is real. There are stories in true crime that everyone knows, Dahmer, Gacy, Bundy, and then there are stories that are so disturbing, so bizarre, or so inconvenient that they quietly slip through the cracks. And it's not because they aren't shocking, but because they don't fit the neat narratives that we're all used to. In this video, I'm covering 5 true crime cases that you've almost certainly never heard of. Cases involving journalists who reported on their own murders, women whose testimony didn't stop after her death, respected members of society who weren't who they claimed to be, and killers who hid in plain sight for decades. Some of these cases were ignored, some were buried, and some were so strange that people didn't know what to do with them. By the end of this video, I promise that you'll be asking the same question over and over and over again. How is this not more well known? So let's get into it. My disclaimer as per the bare shoulders, not naked at all, just wearing a little bandeau. It's summer in Scotland, well, as much of a summer as we get, and listen, it's a bit hot. I'm a bit sweaty, and also I fear that if I never wore like a bandeau top, I'd just pass out on camera and you'd be watching like 50 minutes of me sleeping. Anywho, bestie bees, we are digging into a crazy case. Insane case. This barely has any English coverage, so to say it was challenging to source the information and material, that would be an understatement. So, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, because this was a stinker to research. So, into the mic. ASMR. Probably not ASMR, because I don't think it's like high quality mic, but cola for the road. But yeah, this freak was a reporter, a journalist, and he wouldn't report just on the criminal happenings within his country and his town. He would report on the murders that he would commit. Complete freak. What a loser. Reporting on his own crimes. He couldn't even hold his breath and wait for someone else to report on them. How desperate. And as always, before we talk about and get into the horrific crimes that this evil, vacant-stared monster committed, let's start off with his childhood. Where did he come from? Where did he go? Where did he come from, Cotton Eye Joe? But seriously, what was his childhood like? Is there anything that we could see in his childhood that might have caused premonition for his future? Let's dive in and find out. Let's rewind. We're going back to 1952. And we're going back to the small Balkan town of Kichevo. Now, this was located in what was back then part of the Socialist Republic of Macedonia, which was under Yugoslav rule at this time. Kichevo was quiet. It was a deeply conservative mountain town. It was quite isolated, very tight-knit, and honestly, probably the last place you would expect to find a serial killer. But we all know how that goes. But as we're about to see and dive into, darkness, evil, these serial killing monsters, they don't always require a big city to go under the radar. Imagine being born into this kind of town, just like Vlado Tedeschi. He was the second of 3 children, and the home that he came from was not a home built on love. Let's just say that. So Vlado's father, he was a very hardened World War II partisan, and when he returned from the war, he was literally a shell of the man he used to be. He was quiet, he was withdrawn. He came back with this mentality of ruling the household with an iron fist. He was very emotionally closed off. He was cold. He had chronic PTSD, something he really, really struggled with, but didn't get any help for back then. He barely spoke. He was very stoic. And most importantly, when he did speak, he was very much no nonsense. Don't mess around. Don't try and joke. Don't have fun. It ain't that kind of house. And whilst his father was a strict figure, it was his mother, Blazitsa, who really ruled the house and completely dominated the household. And let me tell you, this woman, I don't think there was a maternal instinct in her body. She very much was not motherly. And honestly, she was the parent of nightmares. Like, proper nightmare fuel was this woman. And this bit's going to be really important to the case moving forward, so make sure you pay attention. Now, Blazitsa, she worked as a cleaner, and she had done for most of her life. She was poorly paid, she was overworked, and more so, she was incredibly bitter about her place in the world. You know, she felt like she deserved more, and more power to her. You know, demand what you want in life. Great. But she was so bitter about her life that she never ever focused on what she could do to improve the life for children. It was very much, I've been hard done by, you need to be hard done by. And it was almost like this bitterness that she had toward the world. She manifested this onto her children. She was a complete tyrant in the household. She was controlling, she was manipulative, she was dominant, she was just a nasty person to be around. She was very obsessive and verbally abusive to her children, to her husband. It was just an awful place to be. And she was such an enforcer of brutal discipline. Towels, clothes had to be folded with military precision. First of all, I'm not going to make it past the front door. And not only this, but shoes had to be perfectly aligned and in order along the wall of the door. And Vlado was just expected to take all of this on the chin. He was expected to obey and respect his mother, despite his mother not respecting him. And he not only feared her, he completely resented her, but he loved her at the same time. Now, Vlado at this point, he was described as a very quiet, withdrawn child. He just kept his head down. Honestly, he wanted to avoid his mother's brutality. He was really polite. He was never the kind of child to raise his voice because, I mean, let's be honest, Blazitsa would not let him away with that. He never caused any trouble within the household or out of the household. And that wasn't because he wanted to be well behaved. It was simply through fear of his mother. He walked on eggshells around this woman. He couldn't express himself. He couldn't do the things that he wanted to do or say things he wanted to say. His mother completely controlled him. And he knew that it wasn't worth his time and effort to go against her domination because the consequences were terrifying. In school, teachers had said that he was very bright but very quiet. He isolated himself, he didn't play sports, he didn't really talk to other children. He kept himself to himself, and to be quite honest, he just preferred reading books than communicating with anyone else. Literature became this young boy's escape. He could immerse himself in a world completely different from his own. He became obsessed with language, with words, with control. And writing would become the only place that he felt truly powerful. Because if he was writing stories or books, he controlled the narrative. He controlled what people said, what people did. And this was something he needed. This was something he craved in real life. And it's around this time that something dark and sinister starts lurking beneath. Now, multiple childhood acquaintances of Vlado, they had said that from a very young age, he appeared to be obsessed with death. Even in high school, he had asked one of his teachers, why is it that poor women die alone? They were reading some sort of wartime memoir, and all he could focus on was the fact that poor women always seemed to be alone. And in the future, they probably looked back on this and thought, holy crap, this is a big flashing red beacon of danger. It is a warning sign. But hindsight is a great thing. Hindsight is 2020, and it's not always clear to see things in the moment. Now, let's talk about the mother-son dynamic, because it was a lot. It was a lot. It really, disturbing, because Blazitsa, she didn't just control Vlado. She dominated his entire life all the way into adulthood. She demanded that Vlado notify her at all times where he was going to be, who he was going to be speaking to. She would punish him if she found out that he was talking to other girls. It's given that creepy mother-son dynamic that we see an awful lot these days, like mothers who are literally in love with their sons. Ugh. And anytime she would catch him talking to other women, she would state that he was becoming weak and that he was pathetic. She said that the only women that deserve his attention is poor women like herself. Those are the only women worthwhile. Yeah, but you can't get with your son, Blazitza, because that would be incest and that would be wrong. So, watch your mouth. Sorry, but to say to your son that the only woman worth respecting is yourself is a bit self-righteous. But hey, love the confidence, pop off, sis. And in that same breath, she would berate him, she would beat him, she would turn him into a shell of himself. And it had this contradicting feeling within Vlado's mind because he's thinking, I absolutely hate this woman, but I have to love her. I'm forced to love her, because if I don't love her, she's going to beat my ass again. And that's not just bad parenting from Blazitza. This is proper serial killer origin story because it sounds all too familiar. It doesn't excuse it by no means because people can have terrible upbringings and grow up to be great human beings. So that's not what I'm saying. But to Vlado, he finds it to be an excuse. These pathetic losers usually do. Now, many forensic psychologists in the future, when the murders took place, they would point out a very glaringly obvious pattern within Vlado's killings. All his victims were middle-aged, they were working-class women who worked as cleaners. It's kind of sounding like he's, in his mind, killing his mum without actually killing his mum. So as Vlado enters his adolescence, the contradictions within his life, they just get stronger and stronger. He did really well in school. He would devour books about criminal justice and law, Yugoslav history, as well as psychology. And then he started writing stories. He was keeping this private journal, and these stories that he would write were stories about strong women who were being punished or silenced by clever men. So he's clever, his mother's strong. Could this story be another crossover where he's trying to get back at Blazitza without actually getting back at Blazitza? I think so. And this is creepy. Obviously it's creepy because we can see firsthand what's going on here. But it went unnoticed because no one's reading someone else's diary. I mean, unless you find it lying and the owner of the diary isn't around, if it falls into our hands and we happen to read it, who's going to say? But Vlado would keep this diary very close to the vest. Now, to the world, he was this model student. He was quiet, he was respectful, he was polite, he was hardworking. But in his mother's eyes, he was just this controlled project. He was a result of her control in her eyes. Vlado himself, at this stage in his life, whilst the outsider looking in might think everything's going well and it's going so great for him, inside, he was becoming a ticking time bomb and the time was running out. Vlado, throughout his teen years, he never had any girlfriends. He never dated, probably because, Blazitza was hiding behind the sofa, what's going on there, Vlad? But he had no girlfriends, no friends, actually. And whilst he didn't have anyone to spend time with, he didn't really feel alone because he would sit and he would watch people, observe them, their every move. And it might come as a shock to you or it might not if you've been listening, but he especially liked to watch women. Women who were alone, women who were walking home alone from their work, women who looked like his own mother. So by the age of 17, Vlado has kind of worked out the career path that he wants to follow. He decides he wants to go into journalism, wants to be a journalist, but in particular, he wants to report on crime. But in his ideal world, this would be violent crime, not just, pickpocketing or breaking into a house. He wants violent, vicious, horrifying crime to report on. Now, when someone had asked him why was he going into journalism with the direct approach of reporting solely on crime, he had stated to them, crime will tell you more about a person than politics ever will. But it is crazy. As we go through this case, you'll see that he wasn't reporting on crime to try and help stop it, to try and help people be aware. He was reporting on crime to learn from it, to learn how to get away with the crime. In his late teens, Vlado, he would be accepted into university where he was going to be able to study literature and journalism. A great fit. And this was going to be in Skopje, the capital, and it was quite a prestigious university. And whilst this sounds great, like Vlado's going to have a successful career, here's the kicker. He never finished university, didn't have the patience, and whilst he didn't finish university, he would tell people he had a degree in journalism. No one really knows why he dropped out university. I don't know if he was impatient and just wanted to immediately get reporting. I think he just wanted it all handed to him. But no one knows why he left Skopje and returned to Kichevo to live with his mother, the woman who dominated his entire life. So, by the age of 20, Vlado, who once seemed to have this promising, bright future, suddenly he was an underachiever. He was this emotionally traumatized young man, and he was now back living under the same roof of a woman he completely despised, but loved at the same time. The woman who had caused this trauma. He's right back there with her. So, in summary, at this point, Vlado, in his teens, he has given us major red flags. Red flag central. If red flag was a street, it would only be Vlad living on it. Socially isolated, obsessed with crime and murder, living with a mum who dominates and controls every aspect of his life. And if you thought things had a possibility of improving in his 20s and his adulthood, no. Grab a snack, get comfortable, because we're only going to go downhill from here. At this point, Vlado is just trying to make his way in the world, right? He's back in Kichevo. He is wanting to rebrand himself. He's like, new place, new me. Well, same place as the year before, but it's new to him now after being in Skopje. But he's doing some rebranding and he's attempting to rebrand himself as the best journalist in the making. Honestly, the way he was able to sell himself, the way he was able to lie about this degree that he never actually achieved, it worked, because somehow he would land a job in journalism. He would be reporting for a state-run newspaper, and his writing would focus notably on politics, education, but mostly it would focus on crime. And let's just say, Kichevo, somewhere that didn't have a hell of a lot of crime, when you've got a journalist who really wants to report on crime, sometimes they're just going to make their own crimes happen, so they have something to report on. People at one point, they did notice just how in depth these articles would go. I mean, this guy, he could yap and yap and yap, certified yapper for all the wrong reasons. He could talk about blood patterns like he was writing a novel. He would include these theories around crimes and around murders that sounded like they were coming exactly from the murderer's mouth. But still, no one raised an eyebrow. And no one was questioning these things at first, because Vlado, he was quiet, he was respectful, he wore thick glasses, he just didn't look like the type. But if Ted Bundy taught us anything, serial killers do not have a type. This guy, though, he was just able to blend in so well with his neighbours, with the public. No one looked at him twice. He was so normal with his perfectly pressed shirts that his mum would do for him. You would just never have looked at him and thought that he could be capable of something so sinister. But I mean, I see the photos and I'm like, I can see it. It's in his eyes. So, 1979 rolls around and somehow, I'm not entirely sure why because I couldn't really find any information on it, but Vlado, he would get married to a woman by the name of Vesna. Now, Vesna, she was incredibly smart. In fact, she was exceptional. Many people wondered, how did Vlado land a woman like this? She was studying law, she would go on to become a very successful lawyer, and she would be the first female lawyer in Kichevo. So the pair, they would go on to have 2 sons together, and they just appeared like this perfect working class couple. They were respected within the community. Vesna was always dressed elegantly, she was super smart, everyone knew how intelligent she was, and Vlado, well, he was a supportive partner, and an alright dad from the looks of it. Him himself was not that exceptional. to everyone else. Vesna was like this force to be reckoned with, and Vlad was just, well, he was just there. To the public, he would appear like this supportive partner. But behind closed doors, this man was eerily cold. Now, multiple family acquaintances in the future, they would describe Vlado as being a ghost in his own home. It was like he was invisible. He didn't drink, he didn't speak, and he also didn't connect. This was a guy who was completely emotionally flat. He was very distant, and he would spend most of his time working away in his study on his journalism or, writing creepy stories about his own mum. Sometimes this guy would not go to bed until 4 or 5 a.m, but Vesna, who is a very hard-working woman herself, she just assumed that Vlado was dedicated to his work. Well, Vesna he was, but he was a bit too dedicated. Then we get to 1990, and this is where cracks, they widen into gaps. God, I could rap. I just rhymed again. I am a poet and, well, now I kind of know it. But Vlado's father, who was already emotionally distant and terribly fragile, this man would die by suicide. His father's death had affected Vlado profoundly, but it wasn't in the grieving son kind of way that you would expect. It was as if the only stabilising force in his life had just vanished, and now he felt like he was truly left alone, with only the voice of his mum living in his head, but also still in his life, controlling his every move, telling him she was disappointed in him, he wasn't doing enough, he wasn't achieving enough. At this point, Vlado withdraws even more. He stops communicating with people. He's spending all his time in his study. He's barely talking to his own wife or children. He would spend entire nights at his desk writing his stories or researching famous serial killers. And listen, I know I do that too, but I'm no Vlado. He also began writing these fictional private stories that no one would see. They were just for his eyes and his pleasure only. And these stories would revolve around the capture, captivity, and control of older women. Older women who were very much like his mum. And these older women, they were cleaners. And the way he would describe them in these stories that he was writing was very much the same bitter language that he would use to describe his own mother. These stories, they would be found later on and examined, obviously, in a new light. But at this point in time, Vlado's just the quiet guy with the impressive wife. And as if one huge psychological blow was not enough for one person to handle, in 2003, Vlado's mother, Blazitsa, she would die of a drug overdose. And this was such a confusing death for him because this was a woman who dominated every aspect of his life, who dominated his childhood, boyhood, adult life. And now she's gone. And honestly, as bad as this sounds to say, her death should have brought him some form of peace. He's free now. But it didn't. And in fact, many forensic psychologists, they believe that his mother's death didn't bring him peace. It did the very opposite. It removed his final restraint. First it was his father, now it's his mother. She's no longer there to punish him. So now, he could punish the rest of the world in her place. Now, after his mother's death, his entire life honestly just seemed to collapse. His grip on reality was visibly slipping. His marriage to Vesna was on the rocks. Shaky at best. She had actually relocated, taken another job. She was living in Skopje, and he was still back home in Kichevo. He became increasingly reclusive, and he wasn't seen outside his home. He was just sitting inside all day, journalisming away. And that's not a word, but we're going to make it one today. But then, even this took a beating. He would eventually lose his job, and this was the kicker. This sent him over the edge. But he decided, you know what, I don't need a newspaper to publish my stories. I'll do some freelance work for some small newspapers, anything to keep my toe in the water. So Vlado, he's reporting on local crimes again. He's getting back into the groove, the thing he's good at. But this time, It was darker, it was scarier, it was creepier, and the details that he was providing in his articles were so much more gruesome and descriptive. This would first be recognised in 2004 when an elderly woman who worked as a cleaner by the name of Mitra Semyonovska, she would disappear, and Vlad would be the one to cover it. So it was a very cold and grey Tuesday morning in Kichevo when Mitra, who was 64 years old at the time, she got up and did her usual morning routine. Now, Mitra had lived in a 2-room modest apartment at the edge of town. She was a retired cleaner and she had actually spent 30 years of her life cleaning different places. It was schools, offices, post offices, doctors' offices. But this work was often overlooked, and yet it was the work that would keep the city running. She didn't have a husband, she didn't have any children, and to be honest, she didn't really have much money. But what Mitra did have was a rhythm to her life, a routine. Now, this daily routine that she had would be groceries, market, mail, and coffee at her neighbour's house if she was feeling in the mood to be social. But it would be this very day where Mitra never made it home. And this was very, very unlike her. Now, neighbours around Mitra, even they had become accustomed to her routine. They knew what time she would leave and what time she would return. It was the same thing every single day. And it would only ever vary if she went over to her neighbours for a little while. But that had also been worked into the routine. Mitra was very predictable. She didn't drink, she didn't travel, she didn't go far away. She always stuck to the same places. So they knew she didn't go off somewhere. And when her outside light was left on and her door was still locked from the outside, neighbours immediately knew something was wrong and they immediately called the police. I'm telling you, sometimes it's good to have nosy neighbours. It would then be on January the 12th, 2005, 2 months after this older woman had disappeared. A local fisherman had noticed something really strange near a riverbed just outside town. He had seen a large black plastic bag, and inside this bag was the naked, decomposing body of Mitra. She had been wrapped in plastic, she had been tied up with a telephone cable, and this would leave a whole town completely shaken. Kichevo wasn't used to this fear, this kind of unrest, this unsettling feeling. Listen, people got robbed. Sometimes someone would drink too much and maybe smash up their house or smash up something in the street. But no one ever got murdered. And murdering an elderly woman just didn't make sense to anyone. The entire crime scene was just a nightmare. Upon closer examination, they noticed that Mitra had in fact been strangled to death. There were ligature marks on her neck that were clearly very deep and deliberate. Her face had loads of bruising and her body even showed evidence of sexual assault. The specifics of her death and of this assault were sort of kept to the police themselves because they wanted to protect Mitra's dignity. But something the medical examiner had been able to tell from Mitra's body is that she hadn't died right away. According to forensic analysis, Mitra had apparently been kept alive, being tortured and assaulted between 30 and 40 days after she disappeared. And this means that somebody took her, tortured her, starved her, humiliated her for over a month. And then when they were finished with Mitra, they just dumped her body like she was trash. And it was clear with the bindings, the way that her body was left, this crime was methodical. Now, police, they did search through DNA systems. They tried to pull whatever they could from Mitra's body, but nothing would give a DNA match. And you can probably imagine at this point, Kichevo, they're living in fear, especially women, and even more specifically, older women. Is it just older women that is this person's target, or is it just women in general? They were terrified because they knew that this monster was predatory, they were intentional, and they were psychotic. Now, would you be shocked to believe that Vlado, he would be one of the very first journalists who would report on the murder of Mitra? Now, he had published a title that I believe, if my translation's been correct, said the following: Kichevo in mourning, the tragic fate of Mitra S. Now, this piece was emotional, it was gripping, and it was incredibly detailed. In fact, it was too detailed. Because even with the details that have been released, police never said the kind of plastic that had been used on Mitra. They had never said the kind of cable that was used to tie it up. And yet somehow, Vlad's article, he's detailing the sort of plastic that was used, the type of cable that was used. He even mentioned that he believed Mitra was likely held captive, a detail that police did not release to the press or anyone. So where was he pulling that from? His imagination or his memory? He even added in lines to the article that said that the killer was methodical and that the killer was preserving her in time. Sounds like you know quite a lot there, Vlad. And the worst part is, right? Well, it's not the worst part, but I left my flabbers gasted, is his editors. The editors in this magazine. They congratulated him. They were like, wow, the depth, the detail, you have such an eye and mind for criminology. No one caught on to the fact that this guy was quite clearly the lunatic who committed this murder. Vlad, he was just like, smile and wave, boys, smile and wave. Because finally this evil monster, he had found a way to merge two identities. He was a poet and a predator, a killer and a chronicler. And the best part, no one suspected a damn thing. Now, I do have a translation of a little extract from one of his pieces. Again, I hope I've translated it correctly. If I've not, let me know. But it says, it is a tragedy that the killer knew the woman's habits, that he used her trust, her daily routine to trap her. He wrapped her in the same plastic that once protected food and now served death. That's oddly specific. Yep. Okay, we're going to move on. But seriously, this is just baffling to me because this isn't just a piece of writing. This isn't journalism. This is a confession in a trench coat. And what's just awful is that with Mitra's murder, Vlad had broken the seal. He had found the perfect age range that he wanted to unleash his rage on. Not only this, but he had successfully abducted, held, and murdered an elderly woman without being caught. He feels like he's finally gained power over life and death, but not only this. He has the power over the public narrative, and he's getting praise for it. And then in 2007, just 3 years later, Vlado would strike again. This time, the woman's name was Lizabika Lykoska. Lizabika, she was 56 years old. She was a quiet woman. She was soft-spoken, and she was just known for keeping herself to herself, but being so polite and chatty if she was approached. Now, just like Mitra, this woman was a cleaner, she was a widow, and she lived alone. Weirdly enough, this woman had lived just a few blocks from where Mitra used to go to shop. So it's like, had the killer, had Vlado spotted her whilst stalking Mitra? It's possible. And just like Mitra, she had a routine that her neighbours were aware of, and it was like clockwork. Up early, go to the market, stop off at a bakery, and then she would go straight to her cleaning job in an office. And the thing with Lizabika is she never missed work. She never ever missed a shift. So when she didn't show up for her shift on November the 22nd of 2007, her employer, her colleagues, immediately knew something was wrong. Any calls made to her went unanswered, her door remained locked, but her keys, her purse, and her coat, they were all missing. Thankfully this time, the police, they act very quickly. They open a missing persons case the very next day, which I mean, like, quickly to me would be the same day, but we'll take it. But this wouldn't matter because just 6 days later, on the 28th of November 2007, a group of utility workers would find her body near an abandoned construction site just on the outskirts of town. Her body had been dumped in a shallow ditch. It had been covered with a plastic tarp and some dirt, and the scene was nearly identical to the scene of Mitra. Lizabika's body was naked, bound with telephone cable, sexually assaulted, and strangled with intense focus pressure. Again, a ligature had been used, and there was no sign of any personal effects for Lizabika. And I know you're all waiting on it, and just like clockwork, what do you know? Vlad, he would release the first article regarding Lizabika's murder. And again, this was disturbingly detailed. In his article, he had detailed the bindings used, the texture of the plastic, and unconfirmed by the police at this point, he said that her body had been sexually humiliated prior to her death. And this again is a translated extract from one of his news articles. Again, if it's wrong, please let me know. But he had stated the woman, perhaps like the first, had lived modestly, alone and unnoticed. Her killer noticed far too much. Like, how are people no seeing this now? Like, this is concerning. He has given out details that the police haven't even confirmed. Why are they not seeing this article and being like, hold up? What the hell? How do you know that? Were you there? Did you do it? The whole tone of the piece was just off. It was wrote with knowingness. This person knew what had happened, and it didn't take long before journalists, they started whispering behind his back because they knew immediately, if we've not got the details, how have you got the details? Many of them even asked, like, how are you obtaining this information? And colleagues had even said to each other, it's as if he was there with the way that he's writing. Ding, 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 ding. You're right. He was there. And suddenly at this point, every woman over the age of 50 who was living in Kichevo, they were terrified. They were scared to leave their homes. They refused to walk alone at night. Some of them even refused to go to work. And honestly, more power to you. Keep yourself safe. Local women, they had even started carrying pepper spray and kitchen knives in their purses. And listen, I'm not even going to say anything about it. I low-key wish that he tried to get one of them so they could have just stabbed him and took him off the earth. But, you know, just my opinion. At this point, this town's illusion of safety was completely shattered, and Vlado, he was just lapping it up. He was just reporting away, doing his journalism, thinking he was hot. And these pieces that he kept writing, because he would write multiple about each crime, they very much tiptoed like one toe in, one toe out of confession and journalism. He was dancing like he was standing on hot coals between the two. Like that. This whole situation to this monster at this moment was a huge game to him. And annoyingly, at this moment in time, he was winning. Now, thankfully, the police at this moment in time, they're putting 2 and 2 together and they're getting 4. So that's good. They're thinking, you know what? These crimes are far too similar. They have got to be related. The women are all over their 50s. They're cleaners. They're widowed. They live alone. They live a modest life with a routine. I think we have a serial killer. Thank God someone said it. Now, they suspected that the killer was local. They were organised. And they were strong enough that they were able to subdue their victims. But I mean, how strong would you need to be if it was someone who was older? But then again, I mean, the women in this story, they're not even old. I mean, 50 these days, it's like the new 30. Now, people were starting to theorise that these deaths could be linked to journalism or law enforcement. And you know, when I heard the first bit, I was like, oh, you're on to something. And then they bring in law enforcement. It's like, oh, God, you know, you just stepped away from the line. You almost had it. Now, with Vlado's third victim, this is when things would really start to shift. The police, they're nervous. The community, they're terrified. And Vlado, he's starting to slip. Now, Vlado's third victim, her name was Zyvana Timokovska. And this woman, she didn't go quietly. So Zyvana, she was 65 years old. She was recently retired and she had picked up a part-time job. Can you guess what this part-time job was? I'll give you a second. Yep, I believe you guessed it right. She was a cleaner. Now, she lived in a small apartment, but she actually lived with her daughter who had just given birth to her first child. Now, this is different to the first 2 victims because Zyvana, she has family around her. She has someone who would notice immediately when she doesn't return home. Zyvana just doted on her daughter and her grandchild. I mean, her whole routine was built around them, getting the groceries, getting some more money for everyone, making sure she had time to watch the child for her daughter. Her whole routine was around them. But devastatingly, on March the 7th, she would drop off groceries back home and then she walked to her cleaning shift and she would just disappear. That very same evening when Zyvana didn't return home, her daughter immediately reported her missing to the police. And the police, they responded immediately in Zyvana's case because they just knew what this was. They knew it must be this serial killing monster. After all, in this case, Zyvana, she met every aspect of the victim profile. She was over the age of 50, she worked as a cleaner, she was retired. They knew this was the same person. And devastatingly, only 3 days later, Zyvana's body would be found. She was just less than a mile away from where Mitra's body had been dumped 4 years prior. She was bound, she was naked, she had been tied up with electrical wire, she had been sexually violated, and her mouth in this case had been stuffed with paper. Now, obviously, this is new and it's intentional. And police interpreted this as a gesturing of silence, trying to silence this woman. Quite clearly, Zyvana was fighting for her life, shouting, screaming for help most likely. And for the first time throughout these cases, forensic fibres on her body included newsprint fragments. Yep, newsprint. The kind of newsprint found in newspapers. Just like the ones that Vlado had stacked in his home. But I'm not pointing any fingers, obviously. Zyvana's daughter and her extended family, they did not stay silent in this case because unlike the first two victims, Zyvana had this huge support system. She had family, she had friends, she had people who loved her. They would speak to journalists, they begged the police to find answers. They organised candlelight vigils and they had even criticised the press for being too poetic and not empathetic. And they would point at multiple articles, but one article in particular really stood out to them that rubbed them the wrong way. And that article was wrote by Vlado Taneski. And when this sort of information was brought to the police, that is when they start looking inwards and they think, do you know what? This could be a journalist. It could be someone reporting on these cases. So they combed through every single detailed article about these cases, and there was one name that was reoccurring and kept popping up and was incredibly detailed. Things were phrased too personally. He had also referred to body positioning that had never been publicised by police, that had never been shared to press and media. Investigators, they then quietly requested a list of all the freelance writers who had submitted reports on all of the murders. And there was one person in particular who had written quite a lot of articles on these murders. And again, it was Vlado. So police at this point for their case, they have 3 women who have been brutally murdered, all over the age of 50, all cleaners, all from Kichevo, all killed by ligature strangulation, all dumped near the town, and all reported on by the same journalist with uncanny detail. And now, for the very first time, they have forensic evidence that would be able to link someone to the crime scene. All they needed now was a chance to search Vlado's home to see if what they were thinking was correct. And thankfully, that opportunity was about to arrive. And honestly, this is just how dumb this Vlado guy is. Like, you can be intelligent and bright and then just completely lack any common sense, and that's what this guy lacked, because when he had even heard that police were closing in and they were looking inward, they were looking at journalists, Vlad didn't think, holy crap, I better stop for a wee bit, take a break, have a Kit Kat. No, he decided he's going to kill again. His 4th victim was Alina Kikovska, and this is when everything would blow up in Vlad's face. Alina was 58 years old. She was a cleaner. If you hadn't already guessed, she was a cleaner, and she had been a lifelong resident of Kichevo. Alina wasn't a recluse. She wasn't someone that kept to herself. She was, in fact, very sociable, very friendly, very warm, very well known. She even had a small Facebook presence. People knew Alina well, and that would be Vlado's biggest mistake, because he would go after someone who people immediately noticed had went missing. Alina had left her home around 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. That day, she was walking to her cleaning shift, but as you can imagine, she never made it. Her employer had called her family by 10 a.m. because they knew this was not like Alina. She never missed a day. She wouldn't not phone if she couldn't make it. And her family were so concerned that by noon, just a couple of hours later, they had reported her missing. When police hear that yet another older woman has went missing, they go straight into serial killer protocol and they're like, do you know what? We need surveillance set up because we need to see what is going on here. Took you long enough, but I guess great now. And devastatingly, Alina's body would be found just 48 hours later. She was found near an overgrown path just on the outskirts of town. She was covered in the same plastic tarp. She had the same telephone cable bindings. There were signs of sexual assault. And in this case, part of her scalp had been shaved. Medical examiners ruled that this hadn't been post-mortem mutilation. It was deliberate, it was symbolic, it was sadistic. But there was elements of the crime scene that made them believe that the killer had been rushed, like he hadn't got to finish doing everything he would normally do. It looked like he had hurried away as if he had been interrupted. Now, when police arrive to the scene, they immediately get it all blocked off and they make a pact. They are not going to release any details whatsoever to the press because they wanted to see if someone would still publish this murder without any details being provided. Because if this was the case, they had their killer. And I'm sure you can guess by now who would have published an article despite no information being released. Yeah, Vlado the Sado. Vlado would publish his article the next day after her body had been found. Now, he had described the body position, the bindings, the shaved patch of her scalp, and he had stated that it was possible symbolic degradation. And at this point, the police are sick and tired of this weaselly scumbag of a man. They're not going to give him the benefit of the doubt any longer. Because, I mean, let's face it, this loser at this point, he basically just signed and dated his own confession. Now they are fully convinced that they have their man and they move in quick. They're wasting no time. They go to Vlado's home and they would arrest him. Vlado went quietly, he went calmly. There was no struggle and no denial on his part. Then they got a warrant to search Vlado's home. And what they found was absolutely bone-chilling. Now, I do have it wrote down exactly what they found, so I am going to read it from the list just to make sure I'm not missing anything out, because what they found was cray-cray. So they had found detailed victim files. Now, these were like meticulously kept notes and photos, even had crime scene sketches and personal thoughts about each woman. There was also unpublished articles, so many of these contained intimate details that the police had not shared with the media. Evidence matching crime scene materials, so the bindings, gloves and plastic sheeting that was used on each individual woman. They'd also found blood-stained clothing. Forensic tests did confirm that this had matched Alina. There was a typewriter and printed drafts of articles about the murders, suggesting that he had actually wrote about the crimes before they were made public. And then they found a notebook, and this notebook was filled with details of chilling fantasies that Vlado Taneski had had before committing these murders and after. He would even describe the feelings that he felt whilst he murdered these poor women. And of course, at this point, police know that they have their killer. There's no if, buts or maybes about it. This is their man. Now, when Vlado had been arrested in June of 2008, this would make front page news. But devastatingly for Vlado, it wouldn't be him writing the story or controlling the narrative. It would be somebody else. And this news article went international, and he must have been raging that he never wrote it. There was a few different headlines that had made international news. So there was journalist caught as serial killer. Man reporting on murders was the murderer. Now, of course, Vlado had people in his life that trusted him, that loved or cared about him. Colleagues of his cried because they never knew the type of man they were working alongside. His editor had to make a public apology for having him on the newspaper. His wife Vesna, she had spoke out and she had said, "I don't believe it, but if it is true, I never knew the man that I married." And Vlado, he never said anything. He didn't cry. He didn't deny anything. He didn't really speak full stop. He just sort of waited in his cell. And during police questioning, it was very much the same again. He barely answered any questions. There was no excuses, there was no confessions, there was nothing of interest really. Police had noted that he had a very cold and detached demeanour, and he had this sense of calm, as though he had been waiting on this moment all along. So then on July the 3rd of 2008, this was just 5 weeks after he had been arrested, Vlado would be found dead in his cell. Now, the death was ruled as suicide via hanging, but many people believe that maybe it wasn't suicide. Maybe this was guards getting revenge. Maybe this was other prisoners who had been allowed in his cell. Maybe it had been staged to be a suicide, but possibly other people wanted him dead, and I wouldn't blame them. Now, because this scumbag had killed himself before this case had went to trial, that meant that a lot of families were left with more questions than answers, because there would be no final confession, there would be no resolution, and to them, it felt like there was no justice. And honestly, my thoughts and prayers and strength, as usual, not only with the victims within this case, but the victims' families who never got proper closure, who felt like justice hadn't been served for their loved one. I am just sending you so much love, and I hope at some point you can begin to heal. In 1897, a young woman in rural West Virginia was found dead. Her neck was twisted at an impossible angle. The doctor would call it an accident, her husband would bury her quickly, and it was case closed, or so everyone thought. But just weeks later, this young woman's mother would claim that the ghost of her daughter came to her at night and revealed the truth about her own murder. This is the only case in US history where a ghost testimony has helped convict a killer. Tonight we are diving into the chilling case of Zona Hester Shue, known forever now as the Greenbrier Ghost. So let me ask you, have you ever heard a true crime story where you almost have to be like, right, wait a minute. Am I listening to a homicide, or is this a haunting? Because this is exactly what happened in Greenbrier County back in 1897, when a woman supposedly came back from the dead to solve her own murder. Yep, you heard that right. A ghost basically became the star witness. And listen, before you roll your eyes, before you click out the video because you're here for true crime, just bear with, because this, it's not a made-up story. It's not some kind of folklore that your grandma tells you after 3 glasses of sherry. This very much happened. This is an actual criminal case with a trial, a conviction, and a murder that honestly might have stayed hidden forever if it wasn't for a very determined mother and, a very talkative ghost. And I know it's all sounding very much like Law and Order, Paranormal Victims Unit, but stay with me because I'm telling you, this case has it all. Small town secrets, the too perfect of a husband with many skeletons in his closet, and a mother who point blank refused to accept natural causes as the manner of death. So let's rewind, because before this victim was known as the Greenbrier Ghost, before this case became so sensationalised, this was a young woman by the name of Elva Zona Hester. Now, she's better known as Hester. No, she's not. She is better known as Zona, so we will be referring to her as Zona throughout the case. She was born around 1873 in Greenbrier County of West Virginia. And back in this time, West Virginia, it was a coal country. Mountains, farmland, small town gossip. And Zona herself, she had grown up in a very modest but very tight-knit close family. She would be raised by her mother Mary Jane Hester, who is going to be so freaking important to this case, and also her father Jacob Hester. Now, her mother was the type of parent who could spot trouble a mile off. She had the intuition, the gut feeling. She just knew when something was up. And spoiler alert, she was not going to be wrong about the man her daughter would go on to marry. When neighbours were asked about Zona, they would describe her as hardworking, she was polite, she was kind. She was a kind of woman that made a very good impression no matter where she went.
But she did also have, a little rebellious streak that many people seem to have before their life tends to go sideways. And by her very early 20s, she is doing what basically any young woman at this point in their life is doing in this time. She's working hard, she's helping her family, and maybe, just maybe, she's hoping to meet the perfect man. And this is where things would take a turn, because in 1896, a strange, mysterious man would wander into the town. And this is where we meet Edward Trout Shue. Yeah, it's quite a name. And he is the man that's going to wind up being at the centre of one of the strangest murder cases in American history. And if a random guy just shows up one day out of the blue to this very small town looking for work as a blacksmith, you can bet that people of the town are immediately side-eyeing him. Where did he come from? Where did he go? Where did he come from, Cotton Eye Joe, Because Edward, he wasn't just new to the town. He was mysteriously new. No one had any idea who this man was. No one knew where this man had come from. And no one knew his true intentions of moving to this town. He was very tight-lipped about his past. He just arrives one day. It's like he respawned in a completely different town. He does get a job at a blacksmith shop, and this was owned by a man called James Cruikshanks. And at first glance, Edward, he's described as being very charming, but if we look a bit deeper, he was too charming. You know the type of man I mean. The one who seems a little bit too smooth for a town where half the population at this point in time can barely even read. He was described as being tall, he was muscular from all his blacksmith work, he was intelligent, and he was also deemed to be good looking if he stood in the right lighting. And above all, he had this confidence that made people pay attention, that made Zona pay attention to him. And when Zona sees him, she falls for him fast. And obviously, in the late 1800s, it wasn't exactly like swiping right on Tinder or Bumblebee or whatever it's called, or any of those kind of apps. But how quick this relationship between Zona and Edward moved, it was quick, even by 19th century standards. So they meet sometime in 1896, and from that moment onward, they were completely inseparable, which, when you're getting to know someone and you think you might like them, it's not exactly unheard of. But people were whispering, people were talking about this flourishing relationship, and a lot of people, they had their suspicions about Edward, but Zona was just so in the love zone that she was ignoring them. She is head over heels in love at this point, and by October of 1896, two of them are married. Now her mother, Mary Jane, she did not like this at all. She was not impressed by the marriage. Like I said before, she, from the minute she met Edward Shue, had the worst feeling about him. She felt like he was hiding something, like there was maybe some dusty skeletons in his closet that needed the cobwebs brushed off. She just didn't trust him at all, and she didn't trust that he would actually take care of her daughter, and shock horror, she was right. Always trust a mother's intuition. So let's pause for just a minute and let's talk about Edward Trout Shue. That name is never going to get old. Because boy oh boy, this man, if he didn't have more red flags than a frickin' bullfighting arena. So Edward was born around 1861, and he was born in Augusta of West Virginia. He had come from a working class family. He had trained as a blacksmith pretty early on into his adolescence. And being a blacksmith, this made him really strong and really skilled when it came to using tools, which, when we know what happened in this case, isn't exactly music to our ears. In Edward's personal life, that was a whole other kettle of fish, because to say it was messy, probably the biggest understatement of the century. Before moving to Greenbrier County, he had already been married twice. And that's fine. Listen, get married, get divorced, as long as you're happy, as long as you're making good decisions and responsible decisions. Life's life. Not every love story is meant to end with a couple together. But Edward Shue, he was a shady little bitch, shall we say. He did not treat women the way they should be treated. So his first wife, Alia Still, They're married and it ends in divorce because, according to Ali, Edward Shue had become very abusive, very violent toward her. And if only it was more modern times, I'm sure the rumours of him being an abuser would have spread a lot quicker, and perhaps Zona, when she heard them, would take a step back. But in the 1800s, divorce courts, they weren't exactly blasting PSAs about abusers. They should have, but they never. But after this comes his second wife, and that is Lucy Ann Tritt. Now, Lucy, she dies very mysteriously one day. People in the community were told it was an accidental death, but it was never fully explained. And I'm sure this sounds familiar because how many other cases have we covered that has a predator with a backstory like this? Now, after Lucy's death, Edward, he would spend some time in prison, and I know what you're thinking. Oh, they must have caught him for some involvement in the pretty obvious murder. Oh no, you would be wrong. Because Edward Shue wasn't arrested for killing his wife. He was arrested because he stole a horse. And people say police priorities are in the wrong place. For real though, the police, they were much more willing to investigate a missing horse than they were a woman who died under very mysterious circumstances. What does that say about the police in that time? So after all of this happens and, words getting round the rumour mill, Edward decides, I need a fresh start. I deserve a fresh start. Like, people are calling me a murderer when I am. But yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. So he packs up and he decides he's gonna move into a completely different town, have a completely different life, and spend his time pretending that his past never existed. And this is how he ends up in Greenbrier County. And as far as most people knew, he was just a newcomer to the town who was potentially looking for, a love interest, a wife. Perhaps even a baby mama, you never know. Now, when Edward and Zona got married, it was very quick, very abrupt. Like, it happened too quick for anyone to be able to process it. And it wasn't a grand event, it was very simple, and I think that's due to the fact of how quickly they moved. But her mother, Mary Jane, the one with the intuition that thinks Edward's a complete POS, she doesn't attend the wedding. She refuses. She says, I cannot, in good faith, give you my blessing. I don't trust this man. I don't want you to marry him. But Zona did as she wanted to do. She couldn't see the wood for the trees. She was so head over heels for this guy. And it wouldn't be too long after the wedding that people noticed that Zona's life, it had started to change for the worse. And outsiders looking in, it made them very uneasy to see not just how her life had changed, but how she had changed as a person. At first, neighbours had said that Zona looked over the moon to be married to Edward. I mean, this was the love of her life, this is the man of her dreams. But very soon after the wedding, they noticed that Zona doesn't really come out as much. She doesn't really go around places as much as she used to. She used to visit her mum all the time before she got married to Edward, and then suddenly she's married to Edward and those visits stop. Suddenly she was so isolated and quiet and just kept to herself or spent all her time by Edward's side. And anytime anyone did see her, anytime that she was allowed to leave the house, because Edward's a freaking control freak, but anytime she left the house, she tried her best to avoid people, and anyone who did see her, they would just say that she looked tired, she looked nervous, she just looked off. And it was very clear that her home living situation was a shambles. It was quite clear that she was living with someone who had her walking on eggshells. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because this is truly the textbook starter of any domestic abuse case. So then we come to 1897 in Greenbrier County. It's winter time, it is brutally cold. It's the kind of weather that is so intense that it just makes you want to stay inside your house and mind your business. So then we come to January the 23rd, and things are strange from the get-go, okay? Edward Shue, he goes to an 11-year-old boy who stays sort of within the vicinity. This young boy was Anderson Jones. So Edward says to Anderson, you know, could you just stop by mine and Zona's house? Just check on her, make sure she's okay, make sure she's not too cold with this weather, and just ask her if she needs, you know, any errands to be ran, if she needs anything from the market. Totally normal, right? Apart from, you know, if you're not busy, why would you expect a child to go check on your wife instead of going to check on her yourself? Make that make sense? Oh wait, it doesn't. So this young boy, he would arrive at the Shoe household and everything looked normal. The door was closed, it seemed very quiet. So he goes up to the door, he knocks on it, and he's waiting a minute, you know, waiting on Zona answering, but she never does. So he decides he'll knock on the window, he'll shout her name, try and get her attention. He does this, and yet again, there's no answer. And at this point, it's not just quiet, it's heavy, it's eerily quiet. And this young boy is not really thinking much at this point, but he is thinking, I want to go and do my own thing. I don't want to have to wait all day to see if errands need to be ran. So he decides he's going to try the door. And when he pushes this door, it just starts to open by itself. When he steps inside, this is when he would see Zona. Zona was lying at the bottom of the staircase. Her legs were perfectly straight, stretched out in front of her. One of her arms was like draped across her chest. She was stiff. She was motionless. And her head was tilted in a way that can only be described as completely unnatural and like something in a horror movie. Her eyes were wide open, but it was very clear that her stare was blank. This young woman wasn't alive anymore. This 11-year-old little boy who has had to witness this, immediately he freaks out. Of course he does. What the frick has he just walked into? So he runs home, he tells his mother what he's walked into, and she immediately sends for Edward. Now, Dr. George Knapp, he would be called to go out to the house. And when he arrives, things are already very, very strange. Because Edward Shue, he had already gotten to Zona's body, and not only this, but he was acting in a way that you wouldn't expect a grieving husband to act. And listen, I totally understand. Grief affects people differently. Some people go into shock. Other people, you know, they start trying to keep themselves busy. They're trying to organise. People have their responses to grief. It's a very, very complicated thing. And we really shouldn't judge anyone for how they acted. But I'm going to be real. I'm judging Eric. Who is Eric? Eric's not his name. But if I'm going to be real, I am judging Edward Shue, and I'm judging him hard. And listen, I have read a lot about different true crime cases. I've watched a lot of true crime TV, and I'm sure you have too. And let me tell you, everything about Edward Shue screams cover up. So, George Knapp, he arrives, okay? He's the doctor. He wants to examine Zona's body, find out what's happened to her. When he gets to the home, Edward has already moved Zona's body upstairs to the bedroom. Not only that, but he's already dressed her in her best Sunday gown. This was like a high neck, stiff collared dress. And then he had also wrapped her favourite scarf around her neck, quite tightly, very organised, tucked it in. And he tells the doctor, this is exactly how she wanted to be buried. Zona told me if she dies one day, not that she imagined that she would because I was the best loving husband ever, but if she died one day, she would want to be buried in her gown, her nice scarf, and it's very important that we keep the scarf the way she wanted it, which is the way I've done it, so don't touch it. So George Knapp, the doctor, he is trying to examine Zona's body, but he honestly, he can't even get his elbow in because frickin' Edward Shue is all over him, watching his every move. He's like cradling his wife's head and her neck, really trying to hide this upper region. And I wonder why. And because of the way he's acting and, he's acting all distressed and distraught, it makes it impossible for George Knapp to be able to examine her. And instead of saying, Edward, can you back up a second? I need to check what happened to your wife. He just says, you know what? This is probably an accident. We'll just say that her cause of death was everlasting faint. And that's 19th century talk for she probably fainted and then her heart just gave out. And I know you're probably thinking, Anna, what the is going on here? Like, how can he say it was just everlasting faint? And I was right there with you. But things only get stranger, right? Because the next day, George Knapp, the doctor, the supposed doctor, he changes her cause of death again. He said that her cause of death was due to childbirth complications. But get this, Zona wasn't pregnant. Not a pregnancy in sight. There hadn't been one. There wasn't going to be one. She was not pregnant. So, Dr. Knapp, how the frickin' frack does someone end up dying from childbirth complications without giving birth to a child? Like, that is how sloppy things were back in this time. Childbirth complications? Bitch, where? So Edward, I don't know if he's trying to play doting husband or it's very clear I'm trying to cover up a murder, but he plans the entire funeral by himself, start to finish. Like I said, he's already dressed Zona. He picks out her coffin. He decides that when people are visiting her and seeing the open casket, they're not allowed to touch her and they're not allowed near her neck and head region. That scarf stayed very tightly around Zona's neck. And not only this, when people were visiting, when people were coming to say their last goodbyes to this beautiful young woman who lost her life, who they loved, her head had been oddly propped up. There was like a pillow underneath her head. And then there was a rolled up cloth to hold her neck steady. And I'm not pointing fingers, but it's like he's trying to hide something. And we come back to Mary Jane, Zona's mother. She is distraught. She saw something bad coming a mile off, but I don't think she could ever have imagined that her daughter would wind up dead. She's watching Edward at this funeral. He is playing this caring, doting husband, like, oh, make sure you're careful with my wife. Please don't go too close. Like, let's stand at a distance and say our goodbyes. She's not buying it for 1 second. She knows he has something to do with this. And here's what I have to say, that Mary Jane Hester deserves a frickin' crown. Because this woman, she single-handedly did not allow her daughter's murder to just be swept away under the rug. She would fight for her daughter's justice. From the moment Mary Jane seen her daughter, she knew that this death, it wasn't natural at all. She said that her daughter's neck looked unnatural and like it wasn't aligned properly underneath that scarf. And when she witnesses Edward basically slapping people's hands away, if they go to hold Zona's hand or touch her face, he slaps them away. And Mary Jane is thinking, you're hiding something. That scarf is hiding something more. So after the funeral, Mary Jane, she decides that she is going to take one of Zona's bed sheets home. Now, this is like a dark coloured bed sheet, and at that point, she didn't really know why she was taking it home. But again, it was that mother's intuition. And when she tries to wash her daughter's bed sheet, immediately the water starts to run red. This bed sheet had been covered in blood. And this is a bit I do have to say, it's unclear if this is some symbolic storytelling or a little bit of folklore that someone sprinkled in. I'm not entirely sure. We'll never really know. But the moment she started to wash this bedsheet, whether the water ran red or not, this is when Mary Jane decided, if no one else is going to investigate the death of my daughter, I'm going to do it myself. And then comes the dreams. For 4 nights in a row, Mary Jane said that her daughter had come to her, not as a dreamlike figure, but as a ghost. She had said that Zona had appeared at the foot of her bed on multiple occasions, and she was dressed in the same outfit that she had been found in. And the spirit of Zona tells her mother that Edward had attacked her, that Edward had murdered her. And the reason for this attack was because Zona didn't have any meat to cook him for his dinner. She was murdered over meat, or, lack of meat. And this caused him to snap. He was so entitled and he was so volatile that he decides at that moment in time that she deserves to die. And he broke her neck. Mary Jane said at this point, Zona, to prove her injury, basically done a 360 with her head. And I'm meaning like Exorcist style. You know, when Reagan does you know what I'm talking about. I'm sure Exorcist is a classic. But she does this 360 with her head, which imagine being the mother and seeing your daughter do that, even if it was a dream, if it was the ghost, it's still horrifying. And then before she comes to, her daughter threw her head all the way back in a way that is completely unnatural, and only a neck that wasn't joined to the spine would be able to do. And here's the thing, right? Whether you believe in ghosts or whether you don't, it's not really the point of this story, because regardless, Mary Jane, she made enough noise about this. She screamed from the rooftops what she had heard. She didn't care if people thought she was crazy. She just wanted to make sure that this story was heard and that she made enough noise to capture people's attention. And she did. Because this was enough noise and enough attention that John Alfred Preston, a prosecutor, he reopened Zona's case. And it was at this very moment when her death went from so-called tragic accident to a full-blown homicide investigation. So at this point in the case, Zona's body has been buried, her husband is acting shady as hell, and her mother, Mary Jane, is doing what every single true crime podcast listener or creator wishes they could do: investigate it themselves. And there was some people at the time that thought, Mary Jane Hester's insane, like what is she all about? But could you imagine being Mary Jane Hester in 1897? Your daughter just died under very mysterious circumstances. The doctor immediately rules her cause of death as one thing, and then the next day it's something else, which is completely irrelevant to her and her body. And let's not forget, the husband that won't let anyone within a midge's eyelash of her. Think to yourself, if that was a situation you were in, would you let it go? Because I wouldn't. Or at least I hope I wouldn't. Something else to note as well is that Mary Jane, it's not like she was known to be this crazy, superstitious lady who believed in spirits, who was looking for attention. This woman was known to be incredibly smart, she was very grounded, she was extremely methodical. And honestly, the kind of woman that if she had been born in a different century, she'd be solving cold cases on Reddit. And because she had such a good reputation, when she spoke, people believed it. I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people did. And suddenly it doesn't become this dream or story, it becomes an accusation. An accusation that many other people would follow. And obviously in a small Appalachian town at this moment in time, this kind of rumour, this kind of gossip, it's kind of next level, and this spreads very, very quick. And some people did wonder, why was John Alfred Preston so eager to take on this case, bearing in mind this woman had a dream or seen a ghost? But he had also heard talk around town for quite a while, gossip, chatter going around that other people felt like the case didn't sit quite right. And because of this, and because the mother was pushing for answers, he felt like this is something he could dive into. And he really commits himself to the cause. He starts going around asking people questions, asking them about Edward Shue, about Zona, about their marriage, their relationship, the dynamics. How did Zona seem in the last couple of weeks? And this prosecutor, he didn't just take the ghost story verbatim, but what he would do is he would use the claims and he would investigate them. He would try and see if anything lines up, if anything matches. And he wants to dig into the facts that had quite clearly been ignored by every single other person, which was a very smart move. So he starts by going to speak with Dr. George Knapp. Now remember, that's the guy who had signed off the death certificate with two different things after being blocked from being able to do a full examination. And when the prosecutor asked Knapp about that day, what happened, the examination, how did it go, he straight up tells the prosecutor, well, I'm not going to lie, Edward wouldn't leave the room. He wouldn't let me get close enough to certain body parts to fully examine Zona, and I just kind of wrote down what I felt might fit. So he's basically saying, yeah, listen, I didn't check the neck area because the husband, he was acting unhinged. So then we come to February the 22nd of 1897, and John Alfred Preston, he orders that Zona's body be exhumed. This was just 1 month after her death, but he is eager to get everything going right away. And let's all remember at this point and give these people their props, because this is 1897. Okay, there's no strong DNA, no fancy forensics, no modern day pathology tools, just a bunch of people in the dark with their shovels, standing in a freezing cemetery with nothing but a lantern and a dream. But what they would find during that autopsy, it would change everything. So this time, the autopsy, this was done in a one-room schoolhouse near the cemetery. And of course, it's not this high-end tech lab or anything like that. It is Zona's body laid out on a table with 3 doctors examining her. Now, they did invite Edward, but conveniently, he wasn't allowed to be anywhere near the process, so he couldn't, control what part of the body they examined. The second these doctors removed the scarf that Edward insisted should not be removed and she should be buried in, when they removed this, things immediately look all kinds of wrong. It was immediately clear that Zona's neck, it had been broken. Her windpipe had been completely crushed, and her neck had been dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. Not only this, but there was finger-shaped bruises around her throat. And in short, she had been strangled at the very least. And it was at this moment when the doctors conclude that this was no accidental death. This was in fact a murder. And it was also at this moment where some locals who thought Mary Jane Hester was just some kind of hysterical mother, they realised that she was actually the woman who was right all along. And let's revisit our old buddy pal, Edward Trout-Shue. How's he feeling about the whole thing? I mean, this must be a shock to his system. Someone murdered his wife? But from the very moment that he got word that Zona's body was going to be exhumed, his behaviour went from weird to what the hell is wrong with you real quick. He started nervously muttering, he was pacing, murmuring things under his breath, and one witness had later said they overheard him saying, "They'll never be able to prove that I did it." Which, I mean, listen, if you've watched even one episode of Dateline, you know that that is the exact kind of thing that no innocent person would say. But this witness, they could also have been lying. Let's be honest, people like to be in the spotlight for their 2 seconds of fame. So, when Edward was then confronted with law enforcement, he doesn't run around denying anything as such, but he did get very, very defensive, and he said that he expected to be arrested, but that they would never find any proof that he done anything. Now, whether he thinks he could outsmart the police, or whether he was trying to paint it like, "You'll never find evidence because I didn't do it, I'm innocent," we'll never really know. But the sheriff who was there, they were like, "Cool story, bro. That's plenty." And they promptly arrest him. So Edward, he is brought in for questioning. And it's during this very questioning that the police start to make some discoveries about his past. And it's the kind of discoveries that left jaws on the floor. Because remember those early marriages that I had mentioned? Well, John Alfred Preston, he was able to get them all confirmed. He was able to contact Ali Estelle, and she confirmed to him that she had left Edward because he was violent and abusive. Now, his second wife, Lucy Tritt, the one who had died under mysterious circumstances, well, John Alfred Preston, he goes and he speaks to Edward's old neighbours, the neighbours of Edward and Lucy at that time. And the neighbours said at that point they suspected foul play. They suspected Edward, but they couldn't prove anything. And now they're standing here, they've got another dead wife, and at this point they realise the pattern's pretty clear. And they truly believed that if Ali still hadn't left that marriage, she might have ended up being the first dead wife that Edward had. And get this, because when Edward had been in prison for stealing a horse, well, John Alfred Preston, he gets in contact with some of the inmates from that time, asks about Edward, and they explain that Edward used to always say his life goal was to have 7 wives. Now, is that creepy? Abso-friggin-lutely. Is that foreshadowing? Abso-friggin-lutely. So at this point, the police, they believe they have enough to charge him, so he would be charged with murder, sent to jail to await his trial. And when he got behind bars, this is when his nervous demeanour suddenly changed. He seemed unbothered, unfazed, and weirdly calm. He starts telling every Tom, Dick, Harry, Fran and Sally that he's confident that he's going to be acquitted, so Why freak out? He's going to be out there in a couple of weeks. He continued telling people that there was no evidence and that God knew his innocence. Meanwhile, at this point, the whole town, they've turned back to Mary Jane's ghostly vision because they're thinking, God, what else can Mary Jane do? I just lost a house key last week. Mary Jane, where is it? And this is where the case goes from completely eerie and horrific to historic. Because when this trial would start in June of 1897, that ghost testimony, the testimony of, well, apparently Zona herself, even if it wasn't used as literal evidence, it became the backbone of the prosecution's motivation. So the trial of Edward Trout-Shue, this would be held at the Greenbrier County Courthouse in Lewisburg, and as you can imagine, it became quite the local sensation. Like, everyone wanted a glance at the man who had become the subject of a ghost accusation. Newspapers from across all different regions, they were there to cover the case as well, and they were calling it the Greenbrier ghost case because, well, of course they were. So the prosecution, they would lay out all the facts. The fact that Zona was fit and healthy before her death, she was young. The fact that Edward's behaviour was beyond suspicious. The autopsy that proved that her neck had been strangled and then broken. And then also Edward's violent past. And also the fact that one of his wives ended up dying under mysterious circumstances, and then another one has died under the same mysterious circumstances. And although they didn't exactly call the ghost as a witness in court because, well, a spectral witness isn't really going to hold up in court, but they did let Mary Jane Hester take the stand. And I have to say, in my opinion, this is one of the wildest moments in all true crime history. So, when Mary gets sworn in, oh, I got an itchy nose, it's kind of the perfect wand for that. But when Mary Jane Hester, she gets sworn in court, and the defence, they believe that they're just going to discredit her by making her look batshit crazy. They wanted her and encouraged her to talk about her dreams, believing that that would convince the jury that she was deluded. But this was a big mistake. Big mistake. Huge. Because when Mary Jane got up there, she was confident, she was calm, she was articulate. And sure enough, she did tell that jury, she did tell that court that her daughter's spirit had come to her and told her how she had died. She said that Zona described every detail to her, and if they doubted her, then why did the autopsy prove those details? Why did it prove those injuries that Zona said she had? And Mary Jane Hester, when she's up on that stand, she doesn't flinch. She doesn't stutter. She's just up there spitting facts and spitting bars. She was able to turn the defence's entire strategy into a mic drop moment for the prosecution. Now, the courtroom was silent. I mean, they were listening to Mary Jane. They wanted to hear everything that she had to say. And reporters would later say that it was very clear that the courtroom was moved by her testimony. The jury was moved by her testimony. And even though the court judge had asked everyone to disregard the testimony regarding the ghost, the story had still stuck. It had already been heard, so whether they disregard it, I mean, once something's heard, it can't be unheard, and of course it's going to have influence. That is why in many trials that you'll see, they will say stuff that they know isn't allowed to be said in court, but the reason they say it is because once it's heard, it can't be unheard. So even if they're told to disregard it, their mind's not gonna. And I mean, can you blame them for this story sticking with them? A mother literally says the ghost of her daughter came to her, explained her injuries, and then these injuries are backed up in an autopsy. I mean, that's the kind of thing that M. Night Shyamalan dreams about. Now, during the rest of the trial, Edward's defence was, it was weak, at the very best. He had claimed that Zona had fallen down the stairs. He stated that she was delicate, she was fragile, and she was accident prone. But Edward, you didn't know she was dead, and suddenly she's fell down the stairs? That is a little suspicious, I'm not going to lie to you. And the thing is, no matter what way he tried to spin his yarn, it wasn't going to work because the autopsy had concluded that her neck had been broken, that she had been strangled. There was fingerprint bruises on her throat. And apparently, every time the prosecution had mentioned his previous ex-wives, especially the one who had died mysteriously, the jury's face said it all. It looked like a slam dunk. So the jury, when they're sent off to deliberate, you know, you're expecting it to be quite a while, but in less than an hour, they came back and they returned the verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. And with this, Edward would be sentenced to life in prison. So he was taken away to West Virginia State Penitentiary. This was in Moundsville, and apparently it's like quite a famous place for being haunted. I would love to visit like a haunted prison or like the haunted asylums and stuff. I think it'd be so interesting. But anyway, less about me, more about the case. But he would never see the light of day ever again. Yay for that. But as you can imagine, even after his conviction, this wasn't a story that was going to die. And in fact, it kind of went on to take on a life of its own. People could not stop talking about Mary Jane Hester. They were like, you know, is it true? Was it false? Did Mary make it up? Or perhaps did Mary subconsciously know and suspect the truth, but felt she had to wrap it in this supernatural explanation in case no one believed her otherwise? And honestly, if that's the truth, it's kind of brilliant because, well, it worked. Because in a time in the world where women weren't taken seriously, which of course translates through to today as well, this mother used a ghost story to make men listen. And they did. Whilst this is all going on, whilst this case is growing arms and legs outside, Edward is just silently rotting away in prison. And he would actually die in 1900, just 3 years after he was sentenced. Now, supposedly he had died from some sort of epidemic that was sweeping its way through the prison. People suspect it would be pneumonia or measles, but it wasn't concluded. When his death was confirmed, no family or friends or anyone came to claim his body, and so he would be buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds. So, you know, karma 1, Edward Shue 0. Now, Mary Jane, on the other hand, she continued living her life quietly, but she continuously told her daughter's story. And this was right up until her own death in 1916. And everyone said Mary Jane's story, it never ever changed, not even slightly. It never wavered. In the town of Greenbrier, as you can imagine, they completely leaned into it. And today, there is actually a West Virginia state historical marker where Zona has been buried, and it reads, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Hester Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. The resulting trial convicted him. Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer." And this marker's still there. A literal state-sanctioned nod to the possibility that a ghost helped solve a murder case. And I think this is the reason why these kind of cases hit so hard for true crime fanatics like myself and like you, is because whether or not you believe in the paranormal, that woman's story is undeniable. It is literally backed up by autopsy facts. Now, of course, people are going to ask, do we believe that the ghost is real? But honestly, it doesn't even matter. I think what matters in this case is the fact that Mary Jane Hester, she made the world pay attention. She was able to turn her grief into action. She had demanded that the system take another look. And when it did, the truth finally surfaced. And that is something that we need to remember in this case. In the end, it's not about Zona's haunting. It's about the fact that a young woman was murdered and her mother refused to let her daughter's voice be buried. And honestly, whether that voice came through a dream, intuition, or something divine, it was still heard. And I have to say, it's kind of weirdly poetic how the legend of the Greenbrier ghost case mirrors the social reality of women back then. Because in the 1890s, widows or mothers, they had next to no authority whatsoever. So if Mary Jane had went to the authorities and said she was worried about her daughter's welfare, if she had told them that her daughter's husband was violent, they probably would have just shrugged it off. But the minute she says, "My daughter's ghost has come to me and told me that her husband was the one that murdered her by snapping her neck," suddenly their ears prick up and they want to listen. Like, could you imagine in this day and age having to say to someone, like, "Listen, a ghost told me this," in order for them to take you seriously? It's infuriating and yet weirdly funny at the same time, because like, what? They're more likely to believe a ghost than what they are a woman who is alive. And I do just want to come back to one of the facts that I pointed out earlier, where some people thought that, you know, maybe she knew that something was wrong and that the husband did something subconsciously, and then she sort of wrapped it up in this ghost narrative to have people pay attention. Well, psychologists and also people who study folklore, they believe that. They believe that Mary Jane's visions, they might have been her brain's way of processing grief. Maybe she knew something wasn't right, and then maybe subconsciously she's picked up on these clues of, you know, Edward, he's not allowing people to touch the neck, he's not allowing people close to the body. And her mind has turned those feelings, that intuition, into dreams that are so vivid that she acts on them. And to be completely honest, I find that so freaking fascinating, because either way, whether it was spiritual or psychological, it still led to the truth. Now, if you visit Greenbrier today, many locals will tell you that if you stand at Zona's grave, you're going to feel her presence. And apparently sometimes if you stand there long enough, you can even hear a whisper that comes through the wind. Zona's grave, it's very modest, it's nothing dramatic and huge, it's actually pretty small, but it makes such an impact. And I have to say, it's kind of beautiful because although she's not here anymore, she's not exactly buried, because her story, we're still telling it centuries later. And as you can probably imagine, her grave is one that is visited quite a lot by amateur ghost hunters. They bring the EMF readers, they have the spirit boxes, and they conduct seances by her grave, hoping to hear Zona tell her own story. And when it comes to her mother's grave, Mary Jane, she's only a few miles away, but it doesn't have the same traction as Zona's grave. And honestly, I think she deserves more recognition. But even if you find this whole paranormal aspect hard to believe, then what you can do is strip it back to the bare bones and see what we're left with. Because when you analyse it that way, it is an all too familiar pattern. We have the charming man with a violent past, a woman isolated and silenced, a death brushed off as an accident, and a loved one who refuses to accept the easy answer. And that is exactly what makes this case timeless, because even 128 years later, is that math correct? Maybe no, I just done it really quick in my head and I do not trust myself. Let me know. But those patterns, they haven't gone away. It's just that these days it's called domestic homicide or coercive control, but it very much exists now and it very much existed then. And this case is so devastating because it's a young woman who's lost her life. She was very early 20s. And when I was examining this case and really looking at it, the thing that haunts me the most is that throughout the world right now, we've probably got hundreds of thousands of victims of domestic violence, men and women. We have so many Zonas out there. And it breaks my heart to think that many of these victims, they might not have a Mary Jane who is willing to fight for them. They might very well feel like they're on their own, and if they do lose their lives, which I pray that is not the case, but if they do, what's to say they're going to get the justice? She was a teenage girl from the slums of Mexico. Now, this teenage girl would claim that she wasn't human. She was in fact an immortal goddess. And her followers, they believed her without question. And what came next is absolutely bone-chilling. Blood rituals, human sacrifice, a cult so disturbing that it was buried from the public memory for decades. This is the disturbing, bone-chilling story of Magdalena Solis, the High Priestess of Blood. Now, if at this moment in time you're thinking this cult could be robes and flower crowns, baby gal, it's not that type of cult. This is something much more sinister and involves blood drinking, brutality, ritual sacrifices that honestly we can't get on board with. And I mean, this woman, she kinda makes Charles Manson look like a yoga instructor. So, you know, there's that. Now, in this case, there are at least 8 confirmed murders, but it's believed to be closer to 20. And this was all done under the rule of this young woman who was so delusional and so dangerous. Everyone just fell at her feet and did as she said. But before Magdalena became this so-called high priestess of blood, she was literally just a girl. Just a girl. And if I'm honest, her beginnings and how her life started is basically just as disturbing as the events that follow. And as said in that movie or musical,
the beginning is a very good place to start, so we're going to go back to 1947. So, Magdalena Solis, not like Gabby Solis in Desperate Housewives, I'm very sorry to say, but Magdalena, she was born in 1947, and she was born in northeastern Mexico in a place called Tamaulipas. I'll be honest, her actual date of birth, as in, the day and the month, is unknown because, well, back then, no one was really documenting the birth of a child who was born into such chaos and poverty. So 1947, that's as good as we've got. And it's not ideal. I'd love to give you all the juicy deets, but it is better than a poke in the eye with a jaggy stick, so we're just gonna have to go with it. Now, I do have to say, Magdalena, she was born into the kind of environment that is either gonna foster a monster or a survivor. And to be quite honest, Magdalena, she was a bit of both. I mean, don't get me wrong, she's definitely teetering more to the side of monster, but she was also a survivor of her surroundings in her childhood. Magdalena's family, they were deep into poverty. They as a family were barely scraping by, but even more disturbing than that, they were entrenched in the world of crime. And from a very young age, Magdalena and her brother Eleazar, they were immersed into this sort of life that just normalised violence, normalised crime, brutality, exploitation, and also power through fear. And listen, that's messed up enough, right? We could really just stop there at how messed up this childhood is, but somehow, somewhere, it gets even worse. Because Magdalena and Eleazar, they would be introduced to prostitution by their parents. That's right, introduced to the world of prostitution by their own parents whilst they are still children. And their family had stated that they never introduced them to the world of sex work for them to be victims, even though they absolutely were. But her family stated that this was a means of survival. This is what they had to do. They needed money, they needed to get by. So they're just gonna pimp out their own children. No one should be having to pimp themselves out, right? But don't pimp out your children. If you're making that choice, pimp out yourself. So Magdalena and Eleazar, they were both sexually exploited by their own family. More so Magdalena, but Eleazar, he faced a lot of that as well. But for Magdalena, this just completely changed her view of the world and the people in it. So I guess for Magdalena and Eleazar, their parents weren't making them pack lunches and sending them off to school. Unless that school was called the School of Trauma, then possibly. The kind of upbringing that these children had is literally the kind of upbringing that would send you to therapy. And then the therapist giving you therapy is probably going to need therapy themselves because it's that messed up. Now, Magdalena, she would garner her own views on sex from a very, very young age, and she never ever thought of sex being intimate or something that you do to connect with a partner or something you do for enjoyment. To her, it was about control. It was a currency that she could use to get what she wanted. And later, this would become a tool for domination. And it's just devastating to think that the only thing that was stable in this young girl's life was trauma. If trauma was an Olympic sport, my God, her parents would be on the first podium. They'd be winning gold in the trauma Olympics because the things that they were putting on to this child from a young age is disturbing and evil. And I am sure that this will come as no shock to anybody considering what Magdalena's been through. But she really suffered with her mental health. Now, sadly, back then, there was no formal diagnosis given to Magdalena, and so there was no formal treatment that she received. But several psychological experts and forensic psychologists who would study her behaviour years later, they believed that there was some kind of delusional disorder that she was suffering from. Some thought paranoid schizophrenia, others thought borderline personality disorder. And if you mix one of these or both of these with her traumatic childhood, extreme poverty, the incestuous control that was going on within her family, then yeah, you pretty much get the perfect storm. And whilst chaos continued to follow Magdalena, it got to a point where she would learn how to manipulate this in a way that worked out best for her. Even as a young teenager, Magdalena had showed signs that she could be very, very cunning. She was able to mirror people's expectations and also be able to slip herself into a role within the group that gave her complete control. She could be seductive, submissive, obedient, or savage, depending on what the situation was. Any situation she was in, she could almost flip her personality to best cope with it. Now, for just a second, let's talk about Eleazar Solis, the brother, the protector, the pimp, and possibly the romantic partner. Honestly, saying that twisted list of things that this guy was to Magdalena makes me want to throw up in my own mouth and then swallow it. I'm sorry, that was disgusting, but it's true. So there are multiple sources that state that Magdalena and Eleazar had an incestuous sexual relationship from the time that they were teenagers. And I mean, their whole view of sex and intimacy was messed up since they were children anyway, so, you know, they probably didn't really realise that there was much wrong with that dynamic, given what they grew up in. We don't know whether it was coercive, consensual, or just born from the mutual trauma that they shared, but what was very clear going through Magdalena's teenage years and early womanhood was that Eleazar, he held a massive psychological influence over Magdalena. Now, Eleazar, he was violent, he was manipulative, he was already involved in lower level crime by the time that he was a young adult. And Magdalena, she clung to this guy like he was a lifeline. He was all that she knew. And again, was this a trauma bond? Was it just sheer survival? Or was this through loyalty? We don't really know, because they're both so incredibly messed up from the childhood that they had. Now together, the pair of them, they became grifters and hustlers, and they were running cons all across Mexico. Now Magdalena, she was utilised for her looks. She was used as bait to lure people in. She was used as almost a distraction whilst Eleazar was able to blackmail or rob their victims. Now the pair of them, they ran many different scams together, but their particular favourite and their usual scam of choice was religious manipulation, which is going to become incredibly ironic later, but we'll get there. So as teens in the early 1960s, Magdalena and Eleazar, they start drifting between different cities. So they're going between Monterrey, Reynosa, and Nuevo Laredo. The pair of them would often work with pimps or small-time gangsters, and they were trafficking sex, and they were also running protection rackets. And people who cross paths with Magdalena in particular, they would be mesmerised by her beauty, but they would also find out very quickly that this might be one of the most calculated young women they have ever come across. And people would very quickly fear her before they would start to worship her. She had this energy and this magneticness that although she was someone you absolutely feared, you also kind of worshipped the ground that she walked on. But even at this moment in time, Magdalena, she wasn't showing any signs of psychosis or delusions yet. It's coming, don't worry. But to outsiders looking in at this moment, she was a survivor, she was a hardened person, and she was just emotionally ice cold. Again, survival mechanisms, things, walls that she's building up to protect herself. And you're probably wondering, well, Anna, what changed this? You know, why did she become delusional? Why did she become psychotic? Well, enter the Hernandez brothers. They're important to the story. It was around 1963 when Magdalena and Eleazar would cross paths with the Hernandez brothers. Now, these brothers... Let me tell you about these brothers. They were two scam artists. They thought they were the absolute bee's boss. They would claim to people that they were two prophets sent by God. Tale as old as time. And when Magdalena and Eleazar would finally cross paths with these two brothers, that is when the deadliest of deadly transformations would take place. Because these brothers, they didn't just bring Magdalena into this cult, they brought her into this cult and gave her the power and control that she has desired her entire life. And let's just say she had a lot of pent-up rage and anger for the things that she went through. And you know what? Rightly so. But that's what therapy is for. But for Magdalena, her therapy would be killing people, which I'm sure we can all agree is not politically correct. So, the Hernandez brothers, we've got Santos and Cayetano. And they were classic grifters. There was no sort of special enlightenment that had happened along the way. They were just two sleazy con men who were looking for fast money. So they were born into poverty, much like Magdalena and Eleazar, and they had learned that, you know what, if you can't gain people's trust, might as well just steal it. And in their minds, the best way of stealing the trust would be through manipulation. Religious manipulation. So in 1962, the brothers, they had set their sights on a small rural village, and this rural village was called Yerba Buena. And Yerba Buena, this was tucked away in this little mountainous region in Nueva Leon. Now, in this tiny rural village, there was no schools, there was no electricity. People here were very much illiterate and also isolated, which to the Hernandez brothers made them the perfect victims. Because when they stood back and looked at this community as a whole, they didn't see something that they wanted to try and build up and fix and help. They simply seen it as an opportunity. So these brothers, they would arrive and they had claimed to be prophets of the Inca god who was sent there to rebuild a sacred temple and also choose their divine followers. So trying to make the people of this town, this small rural region, feel important and feel seen for the first time and like they serve more of a purpose in life. They just made up this half-baked mythology. They were claiming to the villagers that the gods were returning and they were just sent as the messengers. They just swarmed up one day and they're like, yep, God told me I'm hot, I'm in charge, and hand over your livestock. And these people believed them. And you're probably wondering why. The reason that these people had bought into the Hernandez brothers' mythology was because they were promised eternal riches and salvation if the villagers followed them faithfully, paid tribute, and obeyed. These guys just walked up one day and they're like, hey, you ever heard of a pyramid scheme with a twist? The twist being murder. And let's be real, when people are so isolated and so desperate, someone rocking up and saying that they basically have magical powers, that they've been sent from God, sounds a lot more plausible than someone saying, don't worry, help is coming. Like, it is a bad day in society when it sounds more likely that people have powers. And the Hernandez brothers, as soon as they had these villagers on board, they were just using and abusing them. They were spouting this fake religion to them. They were conducting sexual exploitation. They were sleeping with the villagers, telling them that they had to do it. They were just manipulating this power and collecting offerings that were in the form of labour, food, and money. Now, thankfully, it wouldn't be too long before this scam started to fall apart, and the villagers, they started questioning the Hernandez brothers' divinity. And when the Hernandez brothers hear that there's talk of like a union forming, they realise very quickly, damn, we're gonna need something or someone within this cult that makes it unquestionable. Something that people can't say no to, something or someone that the people will believe in, that almost proves the mythology that we are spouting. So in early 1963, Santos Hernandez, he would head back to Monterrey, and the reason he went back here is because he had some underworld connections. And when he returned here, this is when he would finally meet Magdalena and Eleazar Solis. At the point when he met the two, Magdalena, she was working as a teenage sex worker, and Eleazar was her pimp and her enforcer. Santos was immediately captivated, specifically by Magdalena, and he believed that Magdalena was someone who could trick the villagers into believing their mythology. So he offered Magdalena and Eleazar money, but also power, which, as we know, Magdalena, she craves power. And this was giving her this important starring role in this religious scheme that she had always craved. How could she turn it down? After all, this Santos guy who's just walked up one day, he's promised Magdalena that he will worship her as an incarnation of the goddess. And not only this, but she can have full, complete, utter control over the followers. And here's the kicker when it comes to Magdalena, right? Because she wasn't just playing along with this delusion. She actually fully bought into the delusion, and she believed that she was a goddess. Yeah, no, there's a tripped wire in there somewhere. She is a sandwich short of a picnic, because this woman who got picked up off the streets one day now believes that she is a goddess, an enforcer, and this belief that she had would be the thing that changed everything for the worse. So when Magdalena and Eleazar, they arrive in Yerba Buena, and they didn't blend in, because they weren't trying to blend in. They very much wanted to stand out, specifically Magdalena. So from the moment they entered Yerba Buena, they took over. The Hernandez brothers, they introduced Magdalena to the villagers as the incarnation of Coatlicue, who was the Aztec goddess of death, earth, and rebirth. You know, I would, as a villager, I would just want to pump the brakes at death, because what do you mean she's a goddess of death? What can one expect from a goddess of death? And it was likely that this name had just been picked out of thin air, but to Magdalena, she was now officially the goddess of death, earth, and rebirth. She was eat, sleeping, and breathing it. She believed it. She genuinely thought she was the incarnation of Coatlicue. And at this point, so did the villagers. So Magdalena, you know, really just embracing her incarnation role, she starts speaking to the villagers in ritualistic tones. I don't know if that's a ritualistic tone, but it would draw me in. She was also dressing in these very long robes. She was doing ceremonial blessings. But not only this, she would punish anyone who questioned her stance. Now, people had reported that she would often have episodes of glossolalia, which is when she was speaking in tongues during these rituals. Somebody call a priest. And not only this, but very soon after learning to speak in tongues, she was soon demanding blood sacrifices. And honestly, when I first heard this, I was like, oh damn, like the villagers must have been terrified when they first hear of Coatlicue, wanting these blood sacrifices. But it turns out that to start with, these were purely symbolic, and the blood was from animals only, mostly goats or chickens. So the villagers are kind of looking around at each other like, well, I'm not a goat and you're not a goat or a chicken, so we should be safe. But that would all quickly change. Because as time went on for Magdalena Coatlicue, animal blood was no longer good enough. And she starts telling the followers that the gods require human blood, and anyone who disbelieves this are heretics, and their death would purify the group. I'd be shaken now. And guys, honestly, when the goddess of your group and of your cult starts to tell you the vibes are off, someone must die, it's probably time to leave. Now, within this cult at the time, there was 2 teenage boys, right? And we all know what teenage boys are like, and teenage girls. Men, I'm not hating on you, but teenage boys, they're a bit feral, and they'll just say whatever comes to mind, and sometimes that can be pretty offensive, okay? But Magdalena had heard these teenage... Why is my doorbell going? I've not ordered anything. Have I? Don't think so. I'm scared. Let me go check. So I just went to check. Couldn't see anyone at my door. So it's either chapped or run, or I've got spirits. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, right. So we've got 2 teenage boys in the cult who are basically questioning and doubting Magdalena's divinity. And she's not having it. When Magdalena got word of this, she had decided that this was actually treason against the gods, and something had to be done. So the next ritual that had been organised by Magdalena was actually a punishment ritual to these teenage boys. And she brought all the followers in on this, and these 2 teenage boys, they were beaten for hours with sticks, with machetes, just endlessly.
And once these young boys were unconscious, Magdalena and Eleazar, they would then step forward and slit the throat of these young boys and then drink their blood. And this woman, when she drank the blood, she wasn't faking it, and she didn't even flinch. There was no like when she was swallowing it and tasting it. It was going down like wine. She truly believes at this point that blood gives her power and that her rule over these followers was now sealed. These villagers, they were absolutely horrified, but they were too terrified to speak out because Magdalena's made it very clear. Anyone who talks back, anyone who does not believe her, you're next to be on the end of the stick that was hitting someone else than on the end of the stick or machete that you were getting hit by. She was telling these followers that the deaths of, well, she didn't call them victims, but in this case they are absolutely victims. But she said that the deaths of these traitors, basically, they were a sacrifice that had to be made to sustain the goddess. Well, we're not sure if we like you as a goddess, so can we stop doing them and just see if you disappear? Now, obviously in this case, there's more followers than there is leaders, right? Because we've basically got the Hernandez brothers, Magdalena and Eleazar. But there's a whole village full of followers, people who are under their rule. Ultimately, Magdalena knew that if this whole village revolted, they didn't really stand a chance. So to keep the cult obedient and docile, her and Eleazar, they were using a combination of sleep deprivation, hallucinogenic drugs, sexual coercion, public beatings, and bloodletting rituals. Not only this, but they had convinced the villagers that Magdalena could see into the minds of her followers, and if she saw into their mind and seen that there was any doubts or any doubtful thoughts going on, thinking that they might leave her or try and escape the cult, they would be punished immediately. And with these terrifying beliefs in place, this entire group, they just descended into complete submission. And from 1963 to 1964, there would be at least 6 other ritualistic killings. These were all done publicly as a way to keep the other followers obedient, to teach them a lesson. If you speak out, if you doubt me, this is what's going to happen to you. But these poor victims, they were just people who maybe spoke their mind or maybe didn't even say anything at all. Because Magdalena, she can see into people's minds. And suddenly they're being publicly executed in front of and by the fellow cult members. And again, being brutally beaten in the exact same way with machetes, with sticks, for hours. It really just depended on how long it would take them to go unconscious. Before Magdalena and Eleazar, they would step in and slit their throats. Before then drinking their blood and sometimes forcing other followers to do the same. And it really is just terrifying and shocking because this cult was just driven by complete cruelty. There was nothing more to it than that. They enjoyed this cruelty. It was always Magdalena and Eleazar who got to choose the next victim, who got to stage the next ritual, who forced the other followers to participate. Sometimes these followers were holding down these defenseless victims to allow them to be beaten so brutally, unable to fight back. And then after it, when the blood's been shared, they would all drink it as a group, believing that this brings them spiritual enlightenment. Someone, please have a word. And it does get to a certain point where the lines between coercion and complicity get completely blurred because, okay, these people were terrified that they might be next. But apparently, allegedly, according to others that were there, some followers really started to enjoy this sadistic, cruel punishment that was being inflicted into others. And I think it's safe to say that at this point, it's no longer a religious scam. This is a full-blown doomsday death cult. And by early 1964, this tiny village of Yerba Buena had suddenly become this secret prison. At least 8 people are now dead. Their bodies have been completely drained of their blood in these crazy ass rituals. Others in the group were physically and psychologically broken by this woman who thinks she's like a divine goddess. Magdalena, she's so freaking delusional, she's now going by the priestess of blood.
because she's just crossed so many lines, the final line being from complete delusion to just complete deadliness. And like many other cults, Magdalena's would end in panic, murder, and one final gruesome discovery. Because after more than 1 year of Magdalena's complete control, it would finally start to fracture. Her rituals, they had become more extreme, they had become longer, they were bloodier. Survivors would later testify that Magdalena would keep her followers awake for days on end, leaving them completely sleep deprived and delirious. She would keep them up by constant chanting of this rubbish that she was spouting. There was 4 sexual ceremonies, and if this didn't work, she would revert to violence, the thing that she knows best. She would beat her followers if, God forbid, they tried to have a nap. And at this point, this crazy ass woman is just looking for any reason to berate and beat her followers. Any tiny thing they done could be seen as spiritual betrayal. God, if you blinked too much during a prayer, spiritual betrayal. If you forgot a tiny bit of the chant, spiritual betrayal. And God forbid if you looked scared or tired, spiritual betrayal. Now listen, I would not last a second because I have what I can only describe as chronic dry eye, and depending on the weather conditions that day, I'm going to be blinking quite a lot when the dry eye kicks in. So it's safe to say I would be the next victim in line, because you're not going to stop me, Magdalena, okay? Unless you've got my eye drops, which I highly doubt. And not only this, but by 1964, this crazy woman, she was killing people weekly. And this finally brings us to the final victim in this case, Sebastian Guerrero. Sebastian Guerrero, he was a 14-year-old boy who just lived on the outside of Yerba Buena. Now, he wasn't a member of this cult, he wasn't a follower, he was simply a curious child. So one day he is out exploring his surroundings and he is in this cave system which he didn't realise was utilised by this ritualistic cult. And when he stumbles across this cult, they're conducting one of their rituals. He sees and hears them chanting around a fire. There's this woman who is Magdalena, and she's standing over a bound man. Not only this, but this 14-year-old little boy, he would witness this man's blood being poured into a cup and drank. I mean, could you imagine being a 14-year-old? I'd be rubbing my eyes like, is this a mirage of some sort? Because what the hell? This young boy was so terrified and completely freaked out that he just bolted away from this ritual. He ran to the nearest police station in Villagran. He told police exactly what was going on and where it was happening, but the police wouldn't go out until the next day. When they went out the next day, there was no sign of Sebastian Guerrero, because this cult, they had found out that this young boy had spoke, and they would dispose of him. This young boy, Magdalena had ordered that he be captured, and not only that, that he be tortured and sacrificed. And this would be done in a ritual that was even more brutal than the others. This young boy's heart would be cut out, and his blood would be publicly drank and enjoyed by Magdalena and Eleazar. When Sebastian Guerrero had never returned, the police did quickly notice. After what this young boy described, there is no way that they could just brush this under the carpet and think that he's just went into hiding. Several officers from Monterrey and Nuevo Leon, they had launched a formal investigation. And I'm not going to lie, some of them were very sceptical at first. Some of them didn't believe what the young boy had said, what he said he had seen, and they believed that maybe he had just ran away. But there was a few police officers that were absolutely convinced that what this terrified young boy said he seen, he absolutely did. And they wanted to get to the bottom of it and find out where he had went. And when they start their investigation in Yerba Buena, what they would find is silence, fear, and missing people. So police officers, they start questioning the residents and followers of this cult, and it's at this point where the cult's in full panic mode. Like, Magdalena, this is not what you promised us. I thought we were getting like eternal salvation and riches, and here I am being strip searched by the police with a rubber glove. Magdalena, she then ordered some of her most intoxicated, delusional followers to ambush the police with machetes, rocks, sticks, whatever they could, to try and kill them.
But this was a huge mistake on Magdalena's part because this only triggered a full-blown police investigation. They were leaving no stone unturned. In the cave systems where these rituals were said to take place, they would be stormed by the police. And what they found was completely chilling. They would find 2 freshly buried bodies. There was also remnants of ritual sites, so there was animal carcasses, there was blood-stained altars, just truly creepy stuff. There was bones, robes, skulls, ceremonial items, drug paraphernalia that had been used to sedate and manipulate the cultists. Is that a word, cultists? I don't know, but the followers. They also found several emaciated cult followers who were still alive, but they were barely coherent. They were on their way out. They were ready to die. When the police found all of this, there was no doubt that something sinister and deadly was going on. I mean, hello, they've just found 2 freshly buried bodies and skulls and stuff like that, so quite clearly. But they immediately would arrest Magdalena and Eleazar, and honestly, they were captured without any sort of resistance. Magdalena was apparently even smiling when she had been caught. So the Solis siblings, they would be transported to Monterey, and it was here where their case would shock the entire country. Keep in mind, at this point in 1964, people haven't really heard of a death cult, let alone one that is led by a teenage girl who is claiming to be a blood priestess. Now, during interrogation, Magdalena, she didn't confess. She just kept on proclaiming her divinity to the police over and over and over and over again, like, Magdalena, babe, give it up. She had told investigators, I am immortal. They will never get rid of me. I mean, we can all pray, Magdalena, babe. Now, she would be diagnosed with severe psychosis, but she wasn't deemed legally insane. The court, they had determined that she had pathological religious delusions and sociopathic narcissism. Can't argue with that. Magdalena and Eleazar, they would be charged with multiple counts. So there was multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, sexual coercion, assault, and child endangerment. This trial, it wasn't widely publicised, and it's believed that that was due to the religious elements within the case. But both Eleazar and Magdalena, they would be found guilty on all charges. Magdalena Solis, she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. At this point in time, this was the maximum sentence she could receive for the crimes that she had committed. Now, Eleazar, he received the same. Should it have been more? Absolutely. And the thing is, the more survivors that came forward, the more people believed that Magdalena and Eleazar, they had gotten off too easy, because they believed that the victim count was at least 20 or higher. And these victims, it didn't just include adults, there was children in there, really, really young children, younger than teenage years. But without any forensic technology or any documentation, keeping record of what happened, only 8 could be confirmed. After the trial, Magdalena, she was sent to a prison near her birthplace, and she completely disappeared from any sort of court records and documents from the 1980s onwards. Many people believe that she died in prison, but there's a large amount of people that believe that she was released quietly and just disappeared. There is speculation of what Magdalena looked like, but to this very day, there is no photograph of her that's been confirmed to be the woman herself. And to this very day, Magdalena Solis, she remains one of the only confirmed female cult leaders in history to directly commit ritualistic, religiously motivated murders. Most female serial killers are known to operate through poison, manipulation, accomplices, but Magdalena Solis didn't. She was more than willing to get the blood on her own hands. Many psychologists over the years, they have directly compared Magdalena to Elizabeth Bathory, who, if you don't know her, I've already covered a case on her. I'll put it up here, but also in the description down below if you want to watch it. It is crazy. And some had even compared her to a female Charles Manson, but saying that she was more successful in her control of her followers. But what is so crazy about her case is that she didn't start the cult. She was simply brought into it, and then within weeks, she had gained complete control. It all started with a memory card that was found on a street in Anchorage. This card contained 39 disturbing images and 12 horrifying videos. And what these depicted was a woman's final moments. Her final moments of fear and terror. She was being strangled, she was being beaten, she was being mocked, all whilst her killer filmed every single second. This memory card was simply labelled Homicide at Midtown Marriott. This man behind the camera, he wasn't some shadowy figure. He was Anchorage's trusted handyman. A South African man who spoke softly and politely, who blended perfectly into Alaskan life, who worked at a hotel. And his name was Brian Stephen Smith. And when the police uncovered the evidence on this SD card, they didn't just find evidence of a murder. They found a window into the mind of a predator who might have been hunting for years and who has terrifyingly lived in plain sight. I am trying my best not to cry, but I have just done exactly what I did with one of my other videos where I filmed so much and realised I never once had my microphone plugged in, so there is no sound. As you can see, I started the makeup, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the start and I will just get this bit of the story done before I continue with the makeup, so everything goes at the same time. I know you don't care about the makeup. Honestly, I cannot believe I did this again. At least with this one, I caught it, 40 minutes in. But that is still 40 minutes that I just don't have to spare these days. Life's busy. Anyway, so what I want you to do, picture that you are walking down a busy street. You are in Anchorage, Alaska. You're walking down, going about your day, just doing your usual. Maybe you're in your happy place in your mind. And then as you're walking by, the sunlight hits something reflective. What could that be? It really catches your eye, so you turn around. You're like a magpie to a shiny object, which, by the way, I know is a myth, but I'm just, you know me, I love an analogy. So it catches your attention and you're a bit curious, curious George. You go over to this object and you see that it's a memory card. You start to think, oh, this could be someone's work, this could be something important, this could be cherished memories on this card, vacation photos, baby photos, wedding photos. It could be anything. So you decide you're going to be a good citizen. You're going to take it home, you're going to find out whose card it is, and you're going to return it. And this is exactly what this woman does this day, and it changes everything. It changes Anchorage, Alaska forever. Because this woman, she takes it home, she pops it into the device, and boom, she is met with complete nightmare fuel. Because instead of vacation photos or baby photos or a wedding or a new house, she finds one singular folder. And this folder says homicide. All in capital letters. Like, this person who made this folder, they have never heard of subtlety. And this woman, she does what a lot of us would do. Call it morbid curiosity or call it naivety or call it a combination of both. She clicks on the folder and she would open one singular file, and that was enough for her. At first, when she clicked this file, she was thinking, maybe, potentially, this is just some sick joke. Someone's named the folder this as a joke. And this was sick, but it definitely wasn't a joke. The minute she views that first file, she realises that she has stumbled across something that she was never meant to see, that she never should have had to see. And this woman, she doesn't hesitate, she doesn't dilly-dally, she calls the police immediately, quicker than I can click add to cart in a Sephora sale. So once this is handed over to police, detectives, they obviously have to go through this card, they have to find what she was talking about and see what else is there. So they go on. They open this file and there is 39 images and 12 videos. They're all time-stamped, all very organised, every photo and video is obviously going to be time-stamped, date and time, we know that. But when they're viewing it, there appears to be this very normal-looking hotel room. Beige walls, very ugly carpet. The kind of decor that says, I got this in a corporate discount, but that ugly carpet, that was the least of their thoughts. It was the least of their worries. Because when they view a video within these files, they would find a distressed woman. In the background, there's a man's voice, a South African accent, which to the town of Anchorage, that's a foreign accent. Not many people have it, it's very distinct. And the eerie thing about this man with this accent is he's very calm. There is no chaos, it is all control. Now, this poor woman in the video, she's naked. She is being brutally beaten, she is being brutally tortured, she is being dragged across the room by her hair. She was seen to have been strangled with his hands. He then strangled her again later with a wire, also whilst he sang AC/DC's Thunderstruck, a song that many of us these days would associate with the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, or just a very, very good band that we will never ever be able to look at the same ever again. Not only this, but this woman was being sexually assaulted. He was kicking her in the stomach, he was kicking her in the genitals with such a brutal force. And it was clear that this woman was in absolute agony. This man then proceeded to stomp on her throat, to basically jump on her throat, all whilst demanding that she died. Now, the only thing at this point that they can identify about this man who is directing his own movie is the South African accent. That's really all they have to go on. So they're listening to it. They're listening to these clips. And they hear him say, "In my movies, everybody always dies. In my movies, everybody always dies." Immediately telling police and investigators that this was not this man's first rodeo. This was not his first murder. In another clip, he can be heard saying, "What are my followers going to think of me? People need to know when they are being serial killed." So yet again, giving investigators that confirmation that he is absolutely a serial killer. This isn't his first time. And at this point, the accent is all they really have to go on. So they're digging through the files. They're having to view all of these horrific images, all of these horrific sounds. It's brutal. But then they strike gold because they come across a still image. And in this still image, they can see this man clear as daylight. Now, here's the thing about digital files, right? They're kind of tattletales. You know, whether they mean to be or whether they don't, they are tattletales. That metadata is crucial. We have dates, we have exact timestamps, we even get GPS locations. So the tech team, they look at the GPS locations, they pull the coordinates and they plot them on a map. And guess what? They line up perfectly with a Town Place Suites by Marriott in Midtown Anchorage. So they're like, okay, we've got this, it matches up, that's great, but let's just, cover all bases. So they go on the Marriott website, they're checking, they're looking at the rooms, and when they view it, they see that same fugly carpet that was in the videos. Call it detective work or call it interior design doing the Lord's work. And of course, the police at this time, they still have no idea who's in this video. They have no idea who this poor woman is, no idea who this man is. But luckily, they have his still image. Now, the police, they do play his voice over and over again on a frickin' loop like it was the newest hit on Spotify. Anything that might make him more identifiable. But they decide, you know what, let's just cut the BS, let's just go straight to the source. They head over to the Marriott Hotel. They take his still image. And they go up to some of the workers in that hotel and they say, "Do you know this man?" Immediately, there is a quiet awkwardness. Quite clearly, these people know who this man is, but they can't understand why the police would want to know. I mean, this is just a really normal guy who, honestly, is quite boring. And then a housekeeper speaks up and she says, "That person in that image, that's Brian from maintenance." And just like that, the creepy cretin voice in that video has a name. And that name is Brian Stephen Smith. Thankfully, the police, they're able to confirm via CCTV footage and the metadata from the images that Brian was staying at this Marriott the exact same time these images were made. And what's really chilling is they review the hotel surveillance and they see him walk through. He's carrying his luggage. He's smiling away at staff like this normal, friendly guy. It's just your average Tuesday. Or at least, to them it looked like an average Tuesday. But then again, maybe for Brian, maybe this was his average Tuesday. So detectives, they are checking out everything they possibly can, looking at all the sources. Another team, they pull travel records. They want to see, does Brian live here? Or does he live in South Africa and he's travelled here, maybe he's flying back home? And when they check the records, they do see that Brian is not in Anchorage at the moment. However, it's a return flight and he is due to return in a few days. Whether he will or whether he won't is a question on their lips at this moment. And can I just say, by the way, if ever you want to look guilty in a situation like this, just take off, fly away somewhere else when you commit a crime. Only if you want to be the biggest walking red flag in the country. So a few days later, Brian, he arrives back at Anchorage Airport. And luckily for him, he has got a police escort waiting on him. He must feel like a celebrity. But the police, they approach him, okay? The minute that they approach him, they don't even say why they're there, why they're wanting to speak to him. Brian simply sighs, shrugs his shoulders almost and goes, okay. Sorry, what do you mean okay? Like anyone else, they'd be like, whoa, what the hell's going on? Why on earth are you trying to arrest me? What have I done? Tell me what I've done before you try and arrest me. But Brian, he was either too arrogant to care or he knew his time was up. So of course the news breaks in Anchorage of Alaska, actually all over Alaska. Man arrested after SD card reveals disturbing footage. And of course Anchorage, they go into full gossip mode because, honey, it's a small town and people are going to talk, especially when one of their own has been revealed as potentially a sadistic, evil murderer, torturer, sexual predator. Because the thing is, everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew Brian. He was the handyman. He was the one that worked in the Marriott. He was the one who got your repairs done on time. Brian was a reliable guy. But still at this point, no one knows who this woman in the video is. No one knows why she was with this man. No one knows why this man decided to film her brutal murder. So who is Brian Stephen Smith? Well, his life, honestly quite boring. He was from Queenstown, South Africa. He was born in the late 1970s and he came from a well thought of, tidy, conservative family. And there would be nothing in this man's background that screamed future serial killer. Nothing at all. There was no trauma narrative. There was no violent childhood. There was no abusive history. And this is exactly what made him so dangerous, because where the hell did this come from? This might be a case where someone was genuinely born evil. So he did grow up disciplined, but he grew up in no way abusive. South African schools at the time, they were quite harsh, they really valued their education, and it wasn't the kind of place where you would get a congratulations or a trophy or a certificate for participation. It was a lot more than that. But luckily for Brian, he fit the mould that school wanted. He was respectful, he had good manners, he was always tidy, he applied himself. He fit in almost a little too well, because in some ways he just disappeared off into the background. But that's how Brian liked it. Now, he wasn't really remembered for much, to be honest, nothing great anyway. The only thing that people could remember him for was being very meticulous. So he was the kind of person that would have his pencils lined up perfectly, completely straight. His books were open, they were flattened down, his pencil case neatly shut, sitting in the perfect place on his desk. Very, very organised. And if someone next to him, on his right or on his left, if they had a bit of a mess on their desk, their pencils weren't aligned, their jotters were strewn everywhere, Brian couldn't control the impulse to fix it. He had to repair this as well. Anything that seemed like it wasn't perfect to him had to be repaired. So after high school, Brian then goes on to complete national service, and in South Africa at this point, it was mandatory military training. So he completes this. After this, he goes on to get some jobs. He works in the mechanical field and he works in the hospitality field. He was doing maintenance, housekeeping, odd repairs here and there. And his record was clean, not just criminally, but in the workplace. He was efficient at his job. He never left a mess. His bills were always paid on time. He was nice enough to everyone. I mean, didn't really talk at all, but still. So at some point in the early 2000s, Brian decides that he wants to move from Queenstown, South Africa to Anchorage in Alaska. And I did some digging, right? Because I was like, well, that's quite a move. You're going from a hot spot to quite a cold country. Like, what would the reason be behind that? And apparently it is really as random as it sounds. There was not really any rhyme or reason. His immigration papers, they do state that he originally came to Alaska on a work visa, and then at one point he became a legal resident. People did say that a man moving from Queenstown to Anchorage didn't really make sense. Why would he leave the sun for snow? People would usually do the opposite. But I have to say, as someone who loves the cold, as someone who is desperate to go to Alaska, I would love to live there for a period of time. I love the cold weather. And I know people who live there will probably say, trust me, if you lived here, it's not as good. But I love it. That's what I love about Scotland. I love that we kind of have winter most of the year. The second he arrives in Alaska, he slips right into the hospitality scene. You know what, let me just blend as I tell this. Got to do something. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Alaska relies heavily on tourism. So there's a lot of visitors, a lot of people that come and go. And within the hotels, there's a lot of guests who are there for maybe a couple of days, couple of weeks, and then they leave. So a lot of traffic come and go. And this is perfect for someone like Brian, because it means that people never really stay there long enough for people to realise they're missing. Because if someone doesn't return, you just assume that they've went back home, that their trip has ended, not that they've met a brutal demise. And Brian, he was a bit of a hotel hopper. He worked at the Hiltons and he worked at the Marriott's and then he worked at Town Place Suites. And to be fair, he would work there long enough to seem loyal to the job, to the company, but not long enough that people really got to know him. Because that's not what Brian wanted. Brian wanted to be a ghost. Now, his co-workers, they would describe him as being very polite, almost too polite in a way. Like, he was well-mannered and things like that, but he never really joked around. He never really spoke much to his colleagues. And if they ever asked him to go out for drinks after work with the rest of the group, he was always the one turning it down. He had this really weird formality about him, which a lot of people had mistaken for shyness. But this was actually just Brian maintaining a safe distance, so people never got too close. So people didn't have the chance to figure out who he really was. And I do apologise, I don't have the exact date of when this had taken place, but sometime between 2014 and 2015, Brian would marry an Alaskan woman by the name of Alyssa. And when I heard this, I was thinking, Alyssa, you are in danger, my friend. You need to run for the hills and not look back. But according to the record, according to Alyssa herself, their marriage was happy enough. I mean, it was stable. There was nothing untoward. They would buy a nice, modest house that was nearby the Old Seward Highway. It was a lovely neighbourhood, it had the nice manicured lawn, and it was a kind of place where neighbours, they wave at you across the street, they honk at you as they pass by in their cars, but no one really asked too much questions, especially if you don't give them the chance to. Neighbours, they said that the couple seemed very normal, especially Alyssa. Alyssa was chatty, she was friendly, she was outgoing. Brian was a lot more quiet and a lot more reserved. They were always seen out together walking their dog, but if ever Brian was by himself, if you started approaching the fence to, have a conversation and get to know your neighbour, you'd simply get a quick nod of the head. Then he was in the house with the doors bolted and the curtains shut. He did not want to talk to you. And people said that, the couple, they didn't argue much, or at least not in a way that anyone heard. There was never any chaos at their house. There was never any calls to the police. Even after Brian was arrested, Alyssa said one of the reasons that she was so shocked is because she just couldn't see this coming, and not in the way that we hear in a lot of these cases. She had said that Brian barely ever raised his voice. In fact, she's never really heard it fully raised, and he's never once lifted his hands to her. She had even said that he absolutely loved and adored their dog, which is something we don't see with these kind of sadistic creatures. At home, he tried to portray himself as the caretaker. He was the one doing the organising, paying the bills, tightening the purse strings. Everything in this home was labelled, everything had a place, everything was organised. God, even if you went into his garage, his tools were lined up like surgical items. The kitchen was constantly spotless, and this was all the work of Brian. Even his digital life mirrored his personal life. There was folders within folders within folders. He would have wedding photos, vacation photos, work photos, and then there was a folder that no one was meant to see. The folder that would reveal who he truly was. Of course, I said that he never really interacted with colleagues. He never really cared to get to know them. He wasn't really sociable with them, but the truth is, Brian wasn't sociable at all. He didn't socialise with any friends. He didn't really make any effort to have any friends, he didn't drink, he didn't really do anything because he was always telling people, sorry, I've got emergency maintenance work, can't do it, I'm going to be out late. And his wife, Alyssa, believes that she is just married to a hard-working man that's willing to work all hours in any weather condition to better their life. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, because those late nights, they weren't for stability, they weren't for more money. They were his window of opportunity. And I know you're probably wondering, like, with everything that I've said so far, Anna, was there like no warning signs? There's got to have been like something. There always is with these bags. But literally, there was no warning signs, at least nothing that you would call the police over. This man was far too careful for that. He knew what to do, what not to do, what raised attention and what didn't. And the thing is, he knew that he didn't have to dominate at home because there was a whole other crowd of women out there that he knew he could dominate. He knew he could take advantage of. Now, people have said that in social situations, when he would actually talk, which, remember, isn't very often, but when he did, he apparently came across as quite charming. But in hindsight, a lot of people say, was he really charming or was it just the South African accent? Because that's quite a charming accent. It's a nice one. It has a nice cadence. I could understand why someone would find that charming. But if you really paid attention to Brian, if you listened closely, you'd realise that even when you think he's talking to you, he's not saying very much. He would always deflect the question back. It's like he held up a mirror, your question bounced off it and came right back to yourself. Smile and deflect was his motto. You'd literally leave that conversation thinking, oh, what a nice guy. What a nice conversation. When really he's just like smiled, given you half an answer and be like, so what about you? And then you get to talk about yourself. People would always describe this man as being so helpful. He was always there, he was always getting things done quickly, always getting repairs done on time. But helpful might be one of the most deceiving words in English language. As we know, there is this cliche about serial killers having these double lives. Did Brian have a double life? Not exactly. He had 2 lives, but he lived them very much separately. One of those lives was the sort of boring suburban life, or at least that's how he felt it was. He thought it was mundane. He would mow the lawn, he would fix repairs in the house. Then the other person, the other life that he lived was the man who saw people, who saw vulnerable women as disposable props for his use, for his private fantasies. Now, police, of course, they have to conduct a search of Brian's home, and when they do this, it was weirdly clean. And I don't mean like, Saturday, Sunday reset, like spring cleaning vibes. I mean it was a kind of cleaning that was practiced. No mess, no clutter, no stray mail, no drawer filled with random ass letters. Like the jury duty citation that comes and you completely forget to respond. Oops. Again, everything had its place, and even his digital devices. Very clean, very organised. And when they are looking for damning evidence that shows what he's done, what else he's been up to, they don't find that in the house. Because it turns out that also had a place, and that place was in his truck. Now, psychologists, they would later say that Brian Smith, he fitted the organised offender type to an absolute T. High functioning, detail obsessed, narcissistic, the type who feels like they are superior because they're hiding in plain sight. He didn't have random outbursts, uncontrolled violence, because that to him was inefficient. His violence had to be controlled. It had to be methodical, and when he wasn't committing it, he was rehearsing it over and over again in his head. Brian had been living in Anchorage for 2 decades before this SD card was found. That is 20 years of him blending in, earning trust that he did not deserve. Never ever drawing suspicion to himself, and he had built himself the perfect disguise. Be helpful, be polite, be boring, because no one ever suspects boring. When police had showed up at Alyssa's door, the shock that she felt is indescribable, and she actually thought that the police, they were making a mistake. They've got the wrong house. Like, what the hell are you talking about? And in a way, it was, because what she married was a facade. That man didn't actually exist. He was playing a character, he was playing a role. But who he truly was to his core was that sadistic monster that we see on tape, and that is not who she married. She seen no inkling of who that person was. Police had said that the normalcy of Brian's life was exactly what made this case so chilling. He wasn't a drifter going between the cities and towns and picking victims. He was Anchorage's handyman, the one who fixed absolutely everything. So back to the woman in the video, because at this point, when police have opened that SD card, when they found that file, they can only refer to this woman as Jane Doe for multiple days. Just another missing face in a town that already carries so many missing women posters. And the police said what really hurt most in this case was the anonymity, not knowing who this woman was. How can a woman's life be reduced to a timestamp? At this point, the police, they have no other option than to release one of the images that they've found on this SD card. Now, of course, they do blur it enough to protect this woman's dignity, because, of course, as we know, she was naked in the photos and the videos, but they have to leave her face. They have to identify her, and this wasn't the happy face that people once knew. Thankfully, this image, it would reach the right set of eyes. A community outreach worker immediately recognised that woman. And the second she recognised her, she called it in. The woman in the photos, the woman in this video, was Kathleen Jo Henry. And Kathleen, she was 30 years old. She was from a town called Eek, which is a small Yupik village on Alaska's western coast. Now, when Kathleen's name had finally surfaced, it honestly broke something within the people in Anchorage. For days, this woman on the SD card had been an unnamed victim, a blurred image on a police bulletin board. And when police were able to confirm who the woman was, the story stopped being so abstract. So let's talk about Kathleen Jo Henry, someone who actually deserves the attention. She was born in 1989 in Eek, and this is a place with a population of around 300. Very, very small. And it is the kind of town within Alaska that you only get to by boat, by plane, or by pure stubbornness. There doesn't really seem to be any roads in or out, it's just open tundra and severe weather. Now, where Eek sits, the ice comes and goes, but I mean, a lot of the time, it's pretty much there. It is this beautiful, quiet place. It almost looks idyllic. Everyone knows everyone. Someone's either a cousin, a classmate, or both. When people talk about Kathleen, they say that they can still hear her laugh. Apparently, it was this loud, bellowing, unfiltered laugh that just got everybody else going. Now, of course, growing up in Yupik, she had learned the rhythms of subsistence living. Fishing, berry picking, drying salmon on a rack out the front of your house. Family had said that Kathleen loved to sing while she worked. It was a thing that really made time pass for her. And if you were down the other edge of the river, you could hear Kathleen's voice. Something that is so greatly missed now. She was described as being the kind of child who was both bright and restless. She had a desire to see more of the world. But for people in rural Alaska, the world, sometimes that just means Anchorage. I mean, that is the state's only real city. It's a place where rural Alaskans want to go. This is a place where everything is supposed to happen, like college and jobs, opportunity. And like many other young women in the village, Kathleen was seeking that. That's what she wanted. And so she decides to move to Anchorage. She is chasing something bigger. She wants a bigger life for herself. And she was hoping that by moving to Anchorage, she would find a version of herself that didn't have to fight the same small town expectations. But the thing about Anchorage, and something Kathleen possibly wasn't prepared for, is that it isn't easy on anyone, especially if you arrive there without a safety net. It is a place full of opportunity, but it's also a place that is very expensive. The rent in Anchorage could honestly eat you alive if you're not prepared, and if you don't already know someone, you quickly learn how lonely that cold air can be. Now, some people will say that Alaska has 2 seasons. There's winter, and then there's preparing for winter. And Kathleen found herself stuck somewhere in between. She was a very, very hard worker, and she would go between multiple jobs, doing whatever she could to raise her funds. She was doing food service and cleanings, all the behind the scenes jobs that stopped restaurants and hotels from crumbling. For a while, she would rent a place with a roommate, but money was always tight, and unfortunately, Kathleen would find herself falling into addiction, and any stability that she had known just completely disappeared. Shelter staff and outreach volunteers, they remembered her clearly. They said that she had the kind of face that you don't forget. She had very expressive eyes, and she was always up to something, even if she was exhausted. They always remember her singing Whitney Houston on the karaoke. People would stop to listen to her. She was also known to be very funny. She would roast people, but in this gentle, endearing way. She was never too offensive, but she roasted you enough that, you definitely got roasted, but it made you laugh. She was never cruel about it. Everything was all in good fun, and she could give it out and she could take it back. Kathleen was described as having good stretches. There was periods of time where she would try her best to get clean, and she would be clean for weeks. There was times where she was able to start working again, when she even spoke about going back to Eek to be with her family. But like any form of addiction, when people struggle, they can be easily pulled back into that, and relapse is very normal when you're recovering from addiction. And if anyone out there is recovering from addiction, and if anyone has had a relapse, that doesn't mean that you're unworthy. That doesn't mean that you don't deserve to get better. That doesn't mean that that is all you're going to be. It is just a bump in the road, a bump in your journey, and every single journey has them. When was the last time that you were in a car ride that just went smooth? Probably never, because there's always going to be that hurdle that you need to get over. But with that relapse, you can rebuild again. Get yourself a good support system, whether that's family, whether it's friends, whether it is these programs that you can reach out to, whether it's a phone number you can call. You deserve help. You deserve to heal. You deserve to get better. And if you just keep pushing, if you keep fighting, you will get there. And despite everything that Kathleen was going through, everything that she was struggling with, her family, they never, ever, ever gave up on her. I mean, her mother, Sarah, she would call her every single week. They would talk about family gossip, they'd talk about the weather. Kathleen would ask who caught the best fish that week. They were so close. Now, when the calls had stopped in early September of 2019, her mother and the family, they never really thought much of it. Kathleen would kind of go through periods where she would talk a lot and then she wouldn't talk as much. Usually when she was having a reset, when she was sort of having to pull herself together and come back stronger, she would have a bit of distance. So that to go on for, maybe a week or two wasn't out of the norm. But what was out of the norm was when weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks continued to go by and Kathleen hadn't been heard from. Now, people in Eek, they would ask each other, have you heard from Kathleen? Like, how's she getting on? And the response was always, not lately. No one had heard of her. This woman who was always in contact with family and friends suddenly had fell off the grid. Now, when Kathleen's name had hit the news, the people in Eek, they actually found out through a Facebook post, which is just awful. Her entire village finding out that she has been brutally murdered via Facebook. But I mean, this isn't uncommon for small villages to have to find things out this way. But it doesn't make it any less harrowing. One of her cousins had sat staring at Kathleen's photo for over an hour, convincing themselves that that couldn't be Kathleen in the photo. There's no way, there's got to be something that shows that this isn't Kathleen. But devastatingly it was. Now, Kathleen's village, they would hold a vigil days later, candles, singing, prayers, and in the centre was a photo of Kathleen, and it was her holding a cup of coffee, just smiling at the camera. And the family chose that photo because they wanted her to be remembered as Kathleen. They didn't want her to be remembered as Kathleen, the murder victim, because she was so much more than that. Now, when advocates from Alaska's Native Women's Resource Centre, when they heard about what had happened to Kathleen, they were obviously devastated, but they said that it was eerily familiar. Indigenous women make up 18% of Alaska's population, but do you know that they account for nearly half of Alaska's murder victims? They make up 18% of the population, and yet they are nearly half of the murder victims. Once detectives, when they knew this victim's name, when they knew it was Kathleen Jo Henry and they knew that they had Brian Smith in custody, they start digging a bit deeper. Because this whole thing with the SD card, finding Kathleen so easily in a way, it felt too easy. There was something very sinister about this, and each detective kept saying, this can't be this man's first time. You are not that bold, you are not that confident if this is your first murder. And so investigators, they start combing their way through every aspect of Brian Smith's life. They need to check travel records, hotel records, even phone data. And the thing that people forget when it comes to Anchorage, the city itself isn't all that big, okay? However, the terrain around it, the land surrounding it, seems like it goes on forever. It's endless. Highways cutting through tundra, dense woods, frozen lakes. If someone wanted to hide a body, they'd have plenty of options. So when detectives are tracing his movements from earlier on in the year, there was one specific place that kept coming up again and again and again. And that was a stretch of the Old Glen Highway near Eklutna. And this was a remote area north of the town that a lot of people would use for scenic drives or hunting trips. It was the perfect landscape. And when detectives find this spot coming up again and again, immediately alarm bells are ringing in their head, because just months before this SD card was found, hikers came across a decomposing body. In this case, it had gone cold almost immediately. These hikers had found the body in July of 2019, but unfortunately, there wasn't much left of this body to work with. And the state of decomposition made it really difficult to identify who it was. And so this body was just named the Jane Doe of Eklutna. And I feel like we've had a Jane Doe of Eklutna before. Was it the Robert Hansen case? The Alaskan butcher Robert Hansen? I feel like there was a Jane Doe of Eklutna then as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I might be right. But I don't know. So they believed that the Jane Doe of Eklutna could be linked to Brian Smith, but they had no way to prove it right away. I mean, after all, there was no evidence that they could use. The body was so decomposed they couldn't identify the woman. But they do have a lot to work with, because they're able to cross-reference cell tower pings. And Brian Smith's phone signal, it appeared in this area. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And not only that, but it was in the same window of time that the coroner had deemed that this woman would have been murdered. And of course, this alone, it's not really enough proof, but it was enough proof to be able to reopen the case. So during one of Brian Smith's early interviews, the detectives, they decide they're going to play a game with him. They're not going to come out and say right away, did you murder a woman in Eklutna and dump her body there or whatever, because that's too easy. And that's too easy for him just to say no or no comment. So they go into the room and they say to him, is there anything else that you would want to tell us? Anything else that you feel like we should know? Imagining in typical sadistic loser fashion that he's going to want to play the long game. But very shockingly, that is when he would say it. Cool, calm, and collected. There's another one. And this would be the moment that a second victim would step out of the shadows. Brian Smith would tell investigators that he had picked up another victim months earlier, that he had offered her a ride and that she had accepted this, and they ended up spending some time together. He then says that things between them got out of hand. Doesn't specify what got out of hand meant right enough. And his phrasing was as sterile as a personality, let me tell you that much. Like, this man is so bland, so boring, so uninteresting. But he stated that he had left his victim's body out by the highway, out by Eklutna, the same highway where they found Jane Doe. So the police, they end up going back to the Eklutna scene. They check the evidence and they confirm that the location where Eklutna Jane Doe was found perfectly matched the description given by Brian Smith. Detectives would then compare DNA from the remains to DNA from missing persons reports. And by late October of 2019, they had their second victim. And this victim was Veronica Abuchuk. And like Kathleen, Veronica, she was an Indigenous woman, an Inupiaq woman who was originally from Nom. Now, she had been reported missing months earlier by her daughter when she stopped answering phone calls. The family, they had put up flyers around Anchorage, they had checked shelters, contacted hospitals. It was the usual desperate routine that we see in families when their loved one goes missing. But at that point, nothing had come back. And police had called Veronica's daughter to alert her to the fact that they have found her mother's remains. Veronica was both relieved to know what had happened to her mother, but she was also devastated. Veronica was only 52 years old, a woman who had grown up in Nom, this small little town full of wind and grit, and her childhood friends, they were also devastated to learn of her murder. They said that she had always been shy, but she was very artistic. That is how she would express herself to people. She loved sketching people's faces, and she had this talent of capturing their expressions perfectly. One of her friends would even say that she could draw your expression before you even opened your mouth. You didn't have to tell her how you were feeling, she could draw it for you. She had married young, she had several children who then had their own children, and she was a grandmother to the best grandbabies. Her family said that she was patient, she was creative, and she was funny in that very understated way. She didn't have to be loud, but she had this sharp wit that was so captivating. Veronica, she had taught her kids and also her grandkids how to sew traditional garments, how to bead, how to reuse everything. I mean, this woman, she knew recycling better than anyone. She encouraged her family to keep old scraps, old bits of fabric. And they said that she actually saved every scrap of fabric like it was gold. Now, Veronica's last confirmed sighting, this had been in February of 2019, and by that April, her daughter had reported her missing. Now, Veronica's family, they had decided very early on that they wanted Veronica to be remembered as Veronica. They wanted her remembered by her full name, not just initials, not just by headlines, and they would participate in the MMIW vigils across Alaska. They held her photo right next to banners, and these banners, they read, "No more stolen sisters." Her daughter would tell the crowd who had gathered that Veronica was by no means perfect, but she was theirs, and they loved her in every shape and form. Now, advocacy groups, they would use both of these women's names to highlight exactly what they've been talking about for years, that Alaska has one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Do you know that between 2018 and 2023, state data had showed that Indigenous women, they accounted for nearly half of all homicides, and that is absolutely vile to think. The reasons for this, they are complicated, but they're also painfully predictable. Rural isolation, underfunded policing, and the tendency for people to ignore others who are living on Alaska's margins. And the thing is, Brian Smith, he didn't create that problem, but he absolutely exploited it. Because he meticulously chose women who he knew were deemed disposable by some. And that is what makes these crimes even more monstrous. But of course, I'm sure you've guessed that Brian Smith would definitely go to trial for this case. I mean, it was going to be a slam dunk. Now, the two families, the families of Kathleen and the family of Veronica, they came together and they sat front row with each other. Now, Eek and Nom, they might be hundreds of miles away, but they came in there together. They came in strong as a united front. They had red ribbons, red handprints, red shirts, and their message was very, very simple. Remember these women. And that is the purpose of telling this case. This is why these stories are so important. This is two women from different corners of Alaska who deserve to be more than just a footnote in a killer's timeline. They are the ones that matter. Brian Smith, trash, garbage. We don't even need to remember him. Even at this point, when we have two devastated families sitting in a courtroom, Brian Smith still shows no remorse. During his arraignment, he actually smiles. He's smiling at the judge. I don't know who the hell he thinks he is, but he smiled at that judge when the judge had read the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 2 counts of evidence tampering. And this, to him, was an occasion to smile. Reporters who were in the courtroom at the time, they said it was a really weird experience to be in there and seeing this guy because he seemed to be very engaged in his trial. And people might say that's normal, but he was really engaged. He was like really curious. He even started like jotting down notes as if he was like auditing his own trial. Like, judge stuttered over words, not very professional. The prosecution strategy, I mean, it was kind of a slam dunk. It was very easy. They were just going to show the jury how methodical this monster had been. And they didn't have to speculate about this weirdo's mindset. I mean, the footage spoke for itself. Now, the state's forensic analysis, they had determined that the timestamps on the SD card within the images, within the videos, these all perfectly aligned to when Kathleen was murdered. There was no question about it. Now, the defence, on the other hand, they have very, very little to work with. And so much so that they filed motions to suppress the video, arguing chain of custody issues. No, the only issue you've got is that you've got an absolute piece of shit sitting in front of you, and you know there is no way to defend him. He is a monstrosity to society and, quite frankly, should be taken off the face of the earth. Oh my god, I just caught myself in the viewfinder, and here I am slandering Brian Smith when I'm sitting here like Coco the frickin' clown. Let me blend. But yeah, so the court, they have basically ruled that the evidence they've received is airtight. They're not throwing anything out, so up you, basically. So the defence, they're thinking, God, I mean, we really only have one option here, and that's to try and persuade the jury that Brian Smith was a disturbed individual rather than a calculated predator. Bitch, where? All he was calculated his whole frickin' life. But thankfully, the jury did not buy it. Now, when the prosecution delivered their closing arguments, they had described Smith as a man who documented his evil because he thought that no one would ever find it. And the jurors, they would later state that this very sentiment stuck with them. It was the slam dunk for them because they just thought, yeah, can't argue it. No way. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury would return their verdict. And that verdict was guilty on all counts. Now, Brian Smith, he had stood whilst the judge had read the decision, and as the judge did, there was not really any kind of reaction from him. He didn't look angry, didn't look sad, he didn't honestly seem that bothered. All he really did was give a small nod, which, as we know, is something he's done all his life. Now, as that gavel came down, Kathleen and Veronica's family, they were sitting in the front row. Some of them were crying, some of them were just completely rigid because finally they were able to breathe after all this time. But of course for them, just because this man's been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, that doesn't bring back their daughter, it doesn't bring back their sister, their loved one, their auntie, their grandparent, it doesn't bring them back, it doesn't fix it. Anchorage would go through a very strange phase after this trial because suddenly everyone was looking at everyone differently, side-eyeing them just a little bit. Guests in hotels were checking their rooms twice, looking under the bed, looking in the closets because they didn't trust that they were safe now. The people who worked alongside Brian Smith, they started to doubt their other co-workers. How can I trust my judgment of someone when I've worked alongside a murderer for years? And I actually cannot believe I'm saying this, but I need to give the press their props within this case because instead of sensationalising Brian Smith, instead of trying to, give him his nickname and this and that and get scoops, get interviews, they immediately shifted the focus to these women and shifted the focus to Indigenous women, to the systemic failures that allowed this monster to move through the city unseen. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Centre, they did put out a statement and they said that although this brings some form of justice, it doesn't bring safety. Our sisters are still disappearing. And it's like a punch to the gut because we all know it's true. Yeah, we've got justice of some sort for these two women, but there are so many more. So many more who haven't got justice, who won't get justice. So many more women who will continue to be targeted. Because like I've said, this problem didn't begin or end with Brian Smith. He was simply a symptom of this complete chaos. MMIW activists, they would use these cases as their catalyst. They would hold marches throughout Anchorage. They had red handprints over their mouths to symbolise the forced silence of Indigenous women. Posters of Kathleen and Veronica, they were held up throughout these marches. There was signs saying, "No more stolen sisters, we are still here." And this wasn't a protest for the sake of noise. This was a demand of visibility. Now, local lawmakers, they did promise change. They said that they would get better resources for missing persons databases, better coordination with tribal authorities, a dedicated liaison office for rural cases. And some of these things actually happened, but others are still stuck in budget meetings because it all comes down to a price. But for once, people were finally paying attention. Even journalists, they were revisiting old cases of Indigenous women who have went missing. They asked the questions of whether any of these could be connected or whether these could be reopened and investigated further. And it wasn't because they were expecting to find more victims of Smith. I mean, listen, they might. But it was his exposure that had made people realise how easily vulnerable people within Alaska can disappear. Now, I do also want to mention that even though Brian Smith, he received his sentence, 226 years in prison, he will never ever be out. Great stuff. But when detectives continued going through his devices, they did find images that points to a third victim. Now, I do have to say that this victim still remains unconfirmed. We could say unidentified, but the family of Cassandra Boskovsky have come forward and they've suspected that she might have been his third victim. But again, this hasn't been confirmed. And it is worth noting that whilst Cassandra Boskovsky cannot be confirmed as the third victim in this case, in 2024 there was a presumptive hearing by which she had been declared legally dead. So I do hope that we get answers for Cassandra's family, whether she was a victim of Smith or not. They deserve to know what happened to their loved one. And one thing I really want you to remember, when it comes to Kathleen Jo Henry and when it comes to Veronica Abuchuk, what we need to remember here is these were two Indigenous women who were reported missing. And clearly not enough was being done to find them, because throughout the world, Indigenous women and men are disappearing. And the resources don't seem to stretch far enough to find them justice, and that needs to change. This whole case shows us how easy it is for people to disappear, and the world doesn't blink. People just scroll by, people walk by. No one knows because it's not being spoken about enough. So please remember the names of Kathleen, remember the names of Veronica, remember these Indigenous women who need help, who need change. I will ensure that I leave some links down below, some statistics, so you can read into it for yourself. I'm going to do as much digging as I can, find websites and resources that I think could be beneficial for us all to look at and to help support Indigenous women and men all across the world. To Kathleen and Veronica, I just hope that wherever they are resting peacefully. I wish their family healing. I'm sending them all my love, all my prayers. And to Brian Smith, I hope you rot in hell. You are the scum of the earth. What if I told you that one of the most prolific serial killers in European history wasn't some trench coat wearing maniac or a shadowy war criminal, but a fragile, soft-spoken little grandma who brewed death like it was herbal tea? In fact, she actually sold it sometimes like it was herbal tea. Her name was Baba Anushka. She wasn't fast, she wasn't flashy, and she didn't own a single weapon. What she did have, however, was a very deep understanding of chemistry, a wicked little brain, and a 6 to 8 day turnaround time for murder. And just to be clear, this wasn't a little old woman who accidentally poisoned dozens to hundreds of men. This was deliberate, it was systematic, and for the most part, it was totally undetectable. She wasn't just this little old woman, she was a chemist, she was a healer, she was known as a witch, and possibly a mass murderer, who spent decades mixing and brewing poisons whilst others tiptoed around her, calling her granny. This is the case of Baba Anushka. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new here. I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh Oh yeah. As you know from today's intro, we are covering the case of Baba Anushka. Now, I found her whilst I was searching for a case very similar to Aqua Tofana. Because so many of you've requested me to cover the case of Aqua Tofana, but let's be honest, I bet the minute I've said Aqua Tofana, this is what you're hearing. Aqua Tofana, Aqua Tofana, Aqua Tofana. And who said that? But Miss Bailey Sarian herself. That is her case, okay? I'm not even going to try and touch it with a barge pole. Aqua Tofana is Bailey's. And I just felt like I could not cover Aqua Tofana without hearing Bailey in my head. So I was like, nope, I don't want to do that. I'll find something similar. And this is when I found little Baba Anushka. This case is absolutely insane and you are in for a wild ride. But before we dive in, if you are new here, hi, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper. One day I decided I'm going to hop on the internet, I'm going to yap about true crime, and I do it twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday. So if true crime is your jam, I highly suggest you subscribe, get the notification bell on because, like I said, I'm here twice a week, every single week, and it's free. So I don't know what else you could possibly want. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, or any products used on my face today will all be listed in the description down below. But I think without any further rambling and any further ado, let's just get into the case of Baba Anushka. So, Baba Anushka, she was originally born Anna Di Pistonia or Anna Draxon. I don't know if two can exist at the same time, but different sources say different things, so pick one. Now, her actual date of birth, I couldn't seem to find. I do know that she was born sometime between 1836 and 1838, and she was born into what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And honestly, in this time in the world, this was when cholera was more common than compassion, and women, they had about the same rights as livestock, which, if you're not aware, is none. But Anna's situation was different to most of the people around her. She had come from a wealthy family. Her father was a landowner. She was like a little bit of a nepo baby. And because they had this wealth, this gave Anna a particular privilege that basically no one, or a small portion of people actually had, and that privilege was education. So Anna, back in this time, she was one of the elite. She could read, she could write, and according to some sources, she could even speak 5 languages. This included German and Latin, which I believe Latin is like one of the hardest languages that you can learn. My little sister went through a phase where she wanted to learn Latin, and I feel like I remember her knowing how to order a cookie or something like that. It's kind of how far it went. That phase is well and truly over. In this time, it was a time where most people weren't even taught how to write their own names. And then Anna's over here like reading like medical journals and chemical formulas, and her upbringing was just a stark difference to what everyone else was experiencing. So Anna was off to a very promising start. Her future looked bright. She had so many privileges that other children and young adults at this time could only ever dream of. But unfortunately for Anna, this promising start would take a complete nosedive in her early 20s because she fell in love. And sometimes love is a great thing and sometimes it ruins your freaking life. So she had fallen in love with this Austrian military soldier, and he was everything that Anna wanted and more. He was deemed to be dashing, he was handsome, he had thick sideburns that would make a woman back in this time swoon. And as much as Anna thought her future would be with this man, very soon he left her. Straight up abandoned her. And in fact, he had the bloody cheek. He infected her with syphilis. Syphilis, that old 19th century curse that was like a yeast infection from hell. A yeast infection on steroids, but it was terminal. Once she has the syphilis, he then abandons her in complete disgrace. This guy, he should have been burnt at the bloody stake because, excuse you. Now, let's briefly pause here because this is where Anna's story begins to crack. And not because heartbreak is rare, but because vengeance takes root in a heartbreak that never heals. And Anna's never did. This whole experience had truly left Anna as a shell of herself. She never married, she never had children, she completely withdrew herself from society. And it was around this time where she was really just burying herself in medical journals, chemistry journals. She was learning all these formulas and, knowledge that could have been quite important but would be used for something terrible. She was so interested in chemistry, medicine, herbalism, and the occult. And whilst other women Anna's age at this point, they were raising families or they were selling cheese in the village square, Anna was boiling down plants, studying toxins, and experimenting in what later would be called her homemade laboratory, or as we would say, laboratory. But I know it's spelled laboratory, so I just wanted to enunciate. So people very quickly, they learn what Anna's into, right? And they start referring to her as Baba Anushka. This means Grandma Anushka, and whilst it sounds like a name of affection, it was a name of affection and also unease. People really respected Anna, but they also feared her because why is she studying toxins? Why is she mixing stuff up? Why does she have her own little science building? She would soon become the village healer, but she would also become something else alongside it. And that something else was going to be something completely dangerous. Because Baba Anushka, Anna, she had started sort of, selling herself in a way that would really appeal to women of this era. She hated men. I mean, her own heartbreak, that really resonated with a lot of people. And this was a time where divorce wasn't really common, women didn't really have any rights. And Anna was mixing stuff up that, might help women get rid of their problem at home. And that problem was their husband. By the time that Anna, Baba Anushka, was in her 50s, her reputation was sealed. She was a woman that you would visit when nothing else worked. If you couldn't get pregnant, you go to Baba. Husband cheating on you, you go to Baba because she likely has a tea for that. You have a mother-in-law that's ruining your life, visit Baba. She'll probably make that problem disappear. She can cause fate to very quickly intervene. Now, while she could do things to, try and make men behave or try and help with fertility, her business really started to thrive when women were looking for a more permanent solution to their problems. Because like I said, this is an era where divorce is unheard of, domestic abuse and violence is legal and even expected. There was no help and no protection for women, and because of this, some women found themselves becoming really desperate. So when these women would visit Baba Anushka with their stories of abuse, violence, misery and betrayal, she never gave them advice. She gave them little 30ml bottles. And Baba's most popular request would be, "Can you help me get rid of my husband?" And Baba, she would respond. Apparently she was respectful, she was cool, calm, collected, she was even professional. And she would calmly say to them, "Yes, but it will take 6 to 8 days. Let that sink in for a second, because this little lady, she had a standard delivery date for murder. She was like Amazon Prime, but for homicide. She had this thing that she would call her magic water. And this magic water had things like arsenic, mercury, toxic plant extract, strychnine, all those very nice ingredients that is really going to help take care of problems. Now, these were carefully measured, thoroughly tested, and designed to kill in a way that was quiet and almost pain-free. She wanted it to be as painless as possible, so there was no drama, just 6 to 8 days of weakness, stomach cramps, vomiting, and then death. And most doctors at this point, they were chalking it up to tuberculosis because the symptoms were so incredibly similar. And if they didn't think it was tuberculosis, then they just deemed that it was heart failure. And by the times that doctors had come to their conclusion, Baba Anushka, Anna, she had already collected her fee and moved on to the next client. Now, this is where the story is going to get a bit morally weird, and some people are going to agree, some people are going to disagree, and I want to hear it all in the comments down below. Because yes, Baba Anushka, she sold poison to dozens, possibly hundreds of clients. And yes, many of her customers would use this to murder their husband or, their in-laws or a brother who was getting in their way. But it wasn't as simple as evil old woman profits from death, because many of her clients were women with no rights, no options, and no safety. And if you were trapped in a loveless, violent marriage in rural 19th century Serbia, you had two options, and that was to either endure what you're living through or find someone like Baba Anushka. These actions weren't random. She wasn't just killing people for the sake of it. These were very much targeted. Her poison wasn't a tool of fear and terror. It was a desperate woman's nuclear option. And Anushka, she didn't stalk victims, she didn't keep bodies in a creepy cellar or keep them in her freezer. She was a consultant. A criminal consultant, mind you, but a consultant for the broken world. And people have stated that, she wasn't so much like a Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy type of killer. She was just the world's deadliest customer service representative. And it doesn't make it right, I'm not saying that, so don't jump down my throat, but I'm just stating how people felt about her then and how a lot of people still feel about her now. People would go to Baba and say, my husband's beaten me, look at all these scars, look at these bruises. And Baba would be right up front, she would get her little bottle of poison and she'd say, here, try 5 or 6 drops in his soup, and if he's still breathing next week, call me again and we'll up that dosage. And believe me, this operation that Baba Anushka was running, it wasn't like this amateur operation. This was very much a criminal empire that she had built. When Baba was doing her consultations with her clients, she would say to them, and just how heavy do you think this problem is? And this was code for, how much does your husband weigh? Because I need to be able to calculate the correct dose. And she would keep a ledger, and these ledgers, they had actual written records of her clients, the requested dosage, and also the outcomes. So, if Stevie down the road had 3 drops and he's still alive and kicking, it would be like, 3 drops didn't work. We need to try 6. And so on and so forth. She was somewhat of an accountant, but instead of tracking your taxes, she was tracking death. And for decades, no one suspected Baba Anushka. And even if you did suspect Baba Anushka, you didn't dare say anything. And honestly, even if you did speak up and tell people what you had heard or what you had suspected of Baba Anushka, they would just take one look at her and think, absolutely not. She was old, she was frail, she was fragile, she would wear black veils and she would sit silently at the funerals. The funerals of her victims, mind you, but they didn't know this at this point. Now, some villagers, they would, play Chinese whispers and a game of telephone. They would sit and say that Baba Anushka was a witch. Other people would say that she was given special powers by God. And whilst they couldn't always prove or agree on these thoughts and theories, one thing was for sure, and that was that you don't mess with Baba Anushka, because you might find that next week after you tuck into a bowl of lentil soup, you might not wake up from your post-dinner nap. People just viewed Baba as a grandmother figure. Like, genuinely, people compared her to, being like their grandmother. If your grandmother ran a lab that was very much like Heisenberg out of Breaking Bad, and, if your grandma had a kill count that would make the Zodiac blush. But for over 40 years, this little woman got away with the most. She got away with the most. And, we could call Baba Anushka many things. We can sit here and call her a serial killer, or we can call her the best DIY divorce attorney that has ever existed. But regardless, she killed people. People died because of Baba, but no one could prove a thing. That is until someone would slip up. Someone would eventually talk, and this quiet little old lady, she would be exposed for what she really was. And what she was one of the most prolific, deadly poisoners that this world has ever seen. Now, we don't know the name of every single victim, and let's be honest, we probably never will. Some were husbands, some were in-laws, some were business rivals and associates. Now, the body count ranges from 50 confirmed deaths all the way up to 150, some even believing that her death toll is far greater. And I know everyone wonders, how did she get away with this? How was it possible? But we need to remember that we're in a time when autopsies, they were rare. And arsenic poison, that just looked a lot like tuberculosis or really bad food poisoning. Sometimes even just a bad flu. Now, one of Baba's most well-known cases was her victim, Stanislaw Petrovic. He was known to be a very healthy man and also a very wealthy man. He was a landowner. He was in great shape, or, as good shape as you could be back then. And he would suddenly die after being ill for a few days. This didn't make sense to people. I mean, yeah, people got ill and died back then, but a wealthy landowner who was in good health, something was a bit off. But his widow, she had been seen visiting Baba Anushka just a few days before her husband passed away. Bearing in mind, there was suspicions, there was a lot of talk around what Baba Anushka was up to. And of course, his widow had been recommended to Baba Anushka by a previous client. So there was people that knew why she was there. Then there was another victim by the name of Simon Novak. He was allegedly poisoned by his wife after years and years and years of infidelity. She got sick of it and she was like, you know what? You want to cheat on me? I'll make sure you never cheat again. Now, allegedly, this wife had toasted at his birthday with a glass of homemade brandy. And what made this so special and homemade? It had around 2 to 3 drops of Baba's special remedy inside it. And this cheating husband, he was dead before the week was even finished. So by the early 1920s, the suspicions, they were rising. More and more people were talking. The priests, they were praying. The locals, they were whispering. But the police, they had nothing. No fingerprints, no crime scenes, no autopsies. And unfortunately, no surviving witnesses. Because again, poison doesn't scream. So let's just take a moment to acknowledge the obvious and, ask some obvious questions. Number one being, how the hell did this go on for decades? Well, if we're being brutally honest here, right, the police, they weren't really looking, doctors, they weren't really questioning anything, and the system as a whole didn't really seem to care. Many of these victims, they were from rural Serbia. They were men that were known to be violent and were actually quite disliked. So when their death cropped up, people weren't exactly sad about it. And the killers, of course, were women. It was believed back then that women were biologically incapable of any violence. So when all these bodies started turning up and, fingers were being pointed at Baba Anushka, no one wanted to believe that this tiny little woman, who again was frail and fragile and barely reached 5 foot tall, she couldn't possibly be the one who was doing this. And it's not as if she was stabbing people in alleys. Like, everything was really quietly done. She was, making cures, lighting candles, selling herbal teas. And she was even attending the funerals of these victims, allegedly paying her respects. But really, she was probably just trying to make sure that the guy didn't climb out the coffin. And also, it would be hard to pin down Baba Anushka because it wasn't like she was actively killing these people. She was simply selling the tools. In this case, she was the dealer, the trigger puller. And that made her really difficult to catch until she starts getting a bit sloppy. So it would be in 1924 when everything started to unravel. A man by the name of Stevan Petrov, he was a son of one of Baba Anushka's clients. He died really randomly and under what seemed to be suspicious circumstances. His widow, she had been seen recently visiting the wise woman, Baba, and it wouldn't take long before this gossip turned into complete accusations. So police, they are catching wind of all of this, right? And they're starting to get very suspicious and they're thinking, all these people are talking and just how many people can be wrong. So they would actually start carrying out an investigation, and that is when they would find some stuff that left them worried. Because when they went to investigate Baba's home, on shelves behind powders and herbal remedies, they found a ledger, a chilling handwriting record of names, substances, and dosages. Even the dates that these substances were dispensed. And even more damning than this, investigators, they would discover vials, and these vials were filled with white powder. And credit where it's due, these were all organised, labelled and documented as though she was this organised pharmacist. At this point, it feels as though the truth is out. I mean, authorities, they've pulled back the curtain, they've revealed the wizard. Because what they found wasn't just this sweet old lady who was dabbling in herbal remedies and medicine. They would find a systematic, deliberate, decades-long killing network run out of this small little cottage in a rural village by a woman known as Baba Anushka. And yet, even now, despite the ledgers, the evidence, the suspicions, the people that were talking, the level and just how far Baba's crimes go is still unknown. Like I said earlier, there was 50 confirmed deaths, but people believe it's 150 to 200, possibly even more. But one thing is for certain, with this little old lady, for 40 years, she was completely untouchable. So police, they would finally arrest Baba Anushka in 1928 when she was 91 years old, may I add. 91. She is up there, she's alive, kicking and killing people. 91. As you can probably imagine, the reaction across the region was horror, shock and morbid fascination, because this little 91-year-old grandma, she's a serial killer. And she wasn't some moustached, long coat wearing criminal or a political assassin. She was a 91-year-old little woman in Black Widow's weeds, barely 5 feet tall, with hands that would tremble when she adjusted her shawl. But I will say it is a bit of a coincidence that her hands tremble when she's putting on her shawl, but no when she's measuring out toxic poisons. And her ledger didn't look like the shaky hands of someone that trembled. That handwriting was pretty pristine and readable. So the media around this time, well, the newspapers, that was kind of as far as the media went in 1928, but they were dubbing this the trial of the century, and the villagers, they were just, calling it as they seen it. And they called it the day that the devil showed up in court wearing orthopedic shoes. I don't know why I find that so funny. The devil walks into court wearing orthopedic pumps. Right, calm down, Anna, it's no funny. She might be an old lady, but she was still a murderer. Now, of course, during trial, they have physical evidence, right? But the physical evidence wasn't everything. The real nail in the coffin would be testimony from former clients who, at one point, had suddenly developed amnesia about whether they had went to visit Baba Anushka, and if they did, why were they there? Now, once the authorities were offering lighter sentences in exchange for confessions, let's just say that the witnesses came forward and the confessions were pouring out like cheap wine. Because suddenly that coincidental amnesia that they had prior was suddenly clearing up. They were like, oh, you know what? I do remember visiting Baba Anushka. And I might have asked for something like to help with a family problem, but I never asked for poison. I was just asking for a persuasive tea of sorts. Yeah. So the trial, that would open up in Pančevo, which was then part of the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. And let me tell you, this little courtroom was packed. There was journalists, there was off-duty police officers and just the general public. They wanted to catch this little Black Widow in all her glory. And there she was, little Baba Anushka, little Anna, just wrapped up in her little black shawl. Her hair was pulled back in this tight little bun, and her hands were just folded very politely on her lap. And people couldn't help but be fascinated by the fact that she never looked like a serial killer. She looked like a strict school teacher at the very most, the kind that would get annoyed at you if you were caught chewing chewing gum. But make no mistake, because every single word this little lady said, It carried a lot of weight. And of course, her ledger would be used in the trial and many pages of this would be read out. There was one entry that had allegedly read, "Client, widow T, dosage, 4 drops daily, expected death, 6 to 7 days." I mean, she's literally got death down to a science at this point. But people couldn't believe it. People were literally sitting in the courtroom like, there's no way she done it. She's so old, she's so quiet, she looks like she knits booties for little orphan kittens. But that is exactly what made this little woman so goddamn terrifying. From day one, Baba Anushka's defense was honestly really quite simple. She stated that she wasn't a killer, she was simply this humble healer. She also stated that she didn't know her potions were being made to murder, and she certainly never told anyone to kill. She had even stated in court, "I just gave them the medicine. What they chose to do with it, that's their responsibility. Not my circus, not my monkeys." And it is funny, well, it's not funny, haha, but it's just like funny that this little old lady literally has like drug dealer logic, like, oh, I just sold the drugs, but you know, I don't know what they done with them or who they gave them to. Now, one of the most damning testimonies that would take place during Baba Anushka's trial was one that came from Lyubina Petrovic. This was a widow of Stevan, you know, the one whose death basically triggered the entire investigation. She had admitted to police that she had purchased the remedy from Baba Anushka for 600 dinars? Sorry, I don't know, I'm not sure. I really should have googled that, but that's what it said. I'm gonna guess that's the currency that they used. But what I did find fascinating is 600 dinars or dinars or, you know, whatever it was, is actually the equivalent to several months' wages. That is a whole lot of money just to murder your husband. Now, when she had basically confessed to, you know, going to Baba Anushka, she had said that she was only looking for something that would calm her husband down. But, you know, calm, conveniently for her, meant leaving him lying permanently horizontal. There was another woman who had confessed to very similar arrangements. Some of them admitted that they knew it was poison and they knew what they were doing, but they were being abused, they were miserable, etc. Some had even stated that Baba had told them how her method avoids suspicion, and this was all to do with subtle symptoms, slow dosage, no sudden drops. Now, prosecutors, they had painted Baba Anushka as not only the person who administered these drops, but the person who instructed the death. They stated that she was a very quiet mastermind who knew exactly what to deliver to keep her clients happy. And she knew how to do this without ever leaving the comfort of her own home. Now, a lot of people defended Baba Anushka. They said that she wasn't just selling poison, she was selling freedom, and freedom just happened to be sold in 30ml bottles with a poisonous substance. Now, after weeks and weeks of testimony, analysis, and honestly public obsession, the court had finally reached a verdict. Baba Anushka, she would be found guilty on multiple counts of accessory to murder, alongside conspiracy to distribute lethal substances. And here's the kicker. Baba Anushka, she was only sentenced to 15 years in prison for what she had done. A lot of people do say this was down to her age. I mean, she was 91 years old, allegedly, when she actually went to trial. So I guess, you know, it kind of makes sense. But I mean, 15 years for orchestrating possibly hundreds of calculated murders doesn't really seem like enough. Like, I'm sorry, people get more than that for tax fraud. But then, due to Baba Anushka's age and also the shockingly low standards of the 1920s Balkan justice, Baba would only serve a couple of years in prison. She was released on humanitarian grounds. She would return to Vladimirovac, where she would live in relative peace up until 1938, when she was deemed to be 100 years old. Although some say that she was even older, because the exact age and date of birth, etc. isn't known, but we're thinking between like 100 and 103. Now, many locals stated that Baba Anushka lived out her final years in complete peace, quiet, just sitting in her little chair, possibly knitting, just, growing old with life. But others stated that Baba Anushka, she was still administering her poisons in a different method. Now, she had entered court as a villain, she left as a mystery, and to many of the locals, she died as a legend. After her death, she was referred to as the Banat Witch. She was known as someone who never raised her hand and never raised her voice, but she didn't need to do either of those to be feared. Now, there is a question that remains for many people, and this question is, did she really act alone, or could it be possible that Baba Anushka had a network of people who were working for her? Customers, assailants, enablers, all quietly profiting from the poison potion biz whilst keeping their lips sealed. Because many people believe at the ripe age of 91, you don't become one of the most prolific poisoners in Eastern Europe without any help. So let's look at her actual operation for a second. From the outside, her home, her little cottage, it looked like any other little home in this humble village. It was quiet. Don't get me wrong, it was a bit creepy looking, but it was a very basic modern home from the outside. But then you walk inside and you find what can only be described as a one-woman pharmaceutical lab. It was stacked with labelled bottles, dried herbs, grinding tools, hand scales and written logs. Not only this, but so many women were seen visiting Baba Anushka's home on a weekly basis, and these weren't neighbours getting together and drinking tea. This was neighbours getting together and plotting and receiving poison. And let's not forget, these very same women who had visited Baba's home were the exact same women that would become widows days or weeks later. And listen, maybe once or twice could be a coincidence, one or two women attending Baba's house and then their husbands dying could just be a horrific coincidence. But when you have multiple women visiting Baba's house and multiple women's husbands are dropping like flies in 6 to 8 working days, then it gets a bit suspicious. And police kept believing that she wasn't working alone. There had to be someone that was keeping her affairs quiet, but her clients, they were keeping the affairs quiet, apart from when another woman asked for advice and, they'd be sent to Baba. But these clients, they weren't innocent. They were co-conspirators in the whole operation, let's be honest. But a lot of these women were women who were in violent marriages, who seen no other option of escape apart from killing their husband. But there was also just some gold diggers who were getting a bit greedy and wanted some extra money, and they wanted the husband out the way. And whether their part in this murder was survival or just complete selfishness, they were still complicit. They travelled in secret, they paid in cash, they followed Baba's dosage instructions, knowing that these dosage instructions were dosage instructions for death. Take a shot every time I said dosage instructions there. They followed Baba's instructions like it was instructions from a pharmacist. Now, there are rumours, which are unproven but very persistent, that Baba Anushka had used intermediaries. This little woman barely ever left her home, and yet her business expanded past Vladimirovic, even spanning into Romania and Hungary, which were only a carriage ride away. So how exactly was she reaching people across the borders when she was a little woman who couldn't leave her home? Some believe that Baba had run this courier network, that it wasn't always people coming to her, but her courier travelling to said person. They'd deliver the potions, collect the payments, bring it back to Baba, bring back new clients, all under the guise of medicine and remedies. And if this was true, this would make her more than a poisoner. This would make her the matriarch of a regional death cartel. But of course, no one ever testified to being a courier. Why? Because dead men, they don't talk. And the ones who are still living don't want to join them. Now, there is an uncomfortable question that a lot of people have asked over the years, and that was, did law enforcement, did police, Were they aware of this? Did they know about it? Because there was whispers that some local officials and police officers had actually utilised Baba's services. Or when women were reporting abuse and, being scared for their lives, it was said that police and officials, they would just, point them to Baba Anushka because they couldn't do anything. Domestic violence wasn't illegal. And whilst there is all of this speculation, what we actually do know is that Baba Anushka, she wasn't really investigated until 1924, after nearly half a century of suspicious deaths. There was also several wealthy families who would suddenly prosper after their wealthy husband had died. Not a single medical examiner had ever flagged that they believed these victims had been poisoned, despite the classic arsenic symptoms like vomiting, convulsions, tissue necrosis. The signs were all there, and the question remains, why didn't anyone see them? So many people, they do ask, did Baba Anushka have accomplices? And officially, no. As far as we know, no. It wasn't proven in court. It's not really proven now, but many people have their speculations. Because I suppose when it boils down to it, you do ask yourself, is it possible that this little frail old woman operated alone? And in my opinion, allegedly, don't come for me, in the words of Stephanie Harlow, God love her, I find that to be highly unlikely, because her age alone would make me believe that she might have had a hand in prepping and handling substances, especially if her hands actually were trembling. And the reach of just how far her services went, with people not always travelling in the way, to me that implies that there was some form of distribution. And let's not forget the 40 plus years of silence. I mean, that's cultural complicity right there. People knew what she was doing. No one handed her in. That alone gives her accomplices. And whether she had named accomplices, loyal couriers, or just a village of people who were too scared and also too grateful to dob her in, I think there's one thing for certain, and that was that she wasn't working in isolation. I think she was working in some form of ecosystem. One where pain, patriarchy, and poison just fed off each other. And the thing that made Baba's case so chilling for many, it wasn't so much her high number of victims, it was the structure. It wasn't chaotic, it was very organised. Some serial killers are out there building torture chambers and these basements of death, and Baba Anushka, she built a client list. Now, a lot of people, they don't talk about Baba Anushka and the case of Baba Anushka, and that's because history has a really funny way of forgetting things that don't fit perfectly into a box or can't be shelved. Like serial killers, they're easy to categorise. A folk healer, they're romanticised. But a granny with a death toll higher than some military campaigns, that's a bit harder to put in a box and shelve. After her conviction in 1928/1929, she was supposed to disappear into silence and be forgotten, but she didn't. She very much lingered, whether if that was hushed tones within the village or urban legends. Baba Anushka lived on. And whilst male serial killers like Jack the Ripper or Andrei Chikatilo, they get documentaries, they get books, they even get frickin' Halloween costumes, which is sick, Baba Anushka was swept under the rug. No one talks about her. And listen, some people say that it is down to sexism, because history's never known how to deal with an old woman who doesn't fit the evil stepmother mould, but instead this prolific poisoner who has a death toll higher than most. Others say it's nationalism. Serbia, Hungary, Romania, they didn't want to claim her as one of their own. And if you think I'm done talking or think I should be done talking, I'm not quite finished yet, okay? Because there is so much talk around Baba Anushka when you really look into her. And people ask, was she a monster or was she a martyr? Because she wasn't just killing for fun, she was hired. She was hired by desperate women in desperate situations looking for any route of escape. These were women who were often beaten and abused and discarded like they were trash. And to these very women, Baba Anushka, she was salvation in a bottle. And to many people, she is something entirely different. To many, she is a symbol of blurred morality when savagery and survival wear the same face. And listen, was she a feminist icon? No, that's not what I'm saying, okay? Like, I feel like people are going to watch this video and think I hate men. I don't. I love men. The good ones anyway. But I do have to admit, I'm not exactly sad with the kind of people she helped kill. Well, for the ones who were actually abusive and violent. I'm not sad about them. The other ones who were just killed simply because they were wealthy and the woman wanted the money, that's sick and twisted. And the thing with the case of Baba Anushka is she forces a lot of people to ask questions. Like, what happens when justice fails so completely that the only solution appears to be death? And that's not me saying that death is the only solution, but stay with me here, this is what people speculate. These are questions that people actually ask. How far would you go if you knew the police wouldn't protect you, but this little witch down the street, she would? And the thing that many people want to know, and law enforcement wanted to know back then, is just how many people were staying silent so she could operate. And I do believe the reason that Baba Anushka's story lingers is because it is something that could happen again. Maybe not necessarily with poison, but certainly with pills, needles, lies, connections, corruptions. Because there is cases today where maybe the tools have changed, but the desperation hasn't. And it is believed that every village, everywhere, has their own Baba Anushka. Maybe she's a midwife, maybe she's a priest, maybe she's a politician, or maybe she is you. Which I hope not. I don't condone that. Because as we know, sometimes when the law doesn't listen, when the police don't help, sometimes someone lurking in the shadows whispers, I know a way. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I hope you found this one interesting. I love doing the homicidal history. I love doing a homicidal history, and I've been getting so many requests to do one. And when I seen little Baba Anushka, I was like, bingo, we're covering her. Now, I am so keen to know your opinion in the comments down below. Do you believe that Baba Anushka, Anna, do you believe that she was a monster or a martyr? Do you think she was evil, or do you think she was really trying to protect these women who she believed were being abused and mistreated? Let me know. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, including any products used on my face today, they will all be listed in the description down below. Don't forget to leave your case suggestions in the comments. I'll add them to the list and then I'll get around to covering them. But that is it for today. Please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe. Look after each other. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!